In the hours before the landing, something lay suspended over Normandy that historians have never quite been able to name. It was not quite fear. It was not quite certainty. Soldiers in barracks felt it. Farmers in their fields felt it. Even the animals seemed to sense it. A weight pressing down from the channel, something gathering just beyond sight, in the mist and the dark. On the night of June 5th, if you had stood in the wheat fields that rolled toward the city of Caen, you would have felt it too. The air was warm, almost Mediterranean in its thickness, but underneath that warmth lay something else, a coldness, an anticipation. The kind of feeling you get when you know that something is about to break, but you cannot yet see the shape it will take. The countryside around Caen had stood for 1,000 years much as it did then. Stone walls ran between fields, in patterns laid down by the Romans. Orchards grew thick with apple and pear trees, their branches heavy in early summer. Small villages with names like Tilly-sur-Seulles and Villers-Bocage nestled into valleys, their church spires rising into the pale evening light, like fingers pointing toward something no one could quite reach. These were not grand places. They were quiet, ordinary, the kind of landscape that asked nothing of those who lived within it, except that they work and harvest and endure the seasons as their grandparents had before them. But on that particular night, those fields began to hum. It started so faintly that you might have mistaken it for wind, the sound of thousands upon thousands of engines, out beyond the horizon, across the black water of the channel. Ships, transports, the vast machinery of invasion gathering in the darkness like a storm that had learned to think, to move, to carry weapons and fear in equal measure. The hum grew, not louder perhaps, but more insistent, more real, more inevitable. If you had walked those lanes in the deepening twilight, and no ordinary person was doing so, for they all had been warned to remain indoors, you would have noticed how the mist was rising from the low places. The Normandy, that dense ancient maze of hedgerows and sunken lanes that made the countryside almost impenetrable, began to fill with white. It rose from the streams that ran between the fields. It curled up from the damp earth that had never quite dried even in the warmth of June. And as the light faded entirely, that mist grew thicker until you could barely see 10 yards in any direction. The world contracted. Everything became close. Everything became intimate and strange. It was, perhaps, a mercy. The people sheltering in their homes, the soldiers in their barracks, the officers in their command posts, none of them could see what was coming. They could only hear it. They could only feel it. And there was something almost gentle in that distance, in that obscurity. For a few more hours, the future was still unknowable. For a few more hours, anything remained possible. The roads leading into Caen were quiet. The city itself sat perhaps 8 miles inland from the coast, tucked back from the beaches where the landings would begin in just a few hours. It was a medieval city, though it had grown in the centuries since the Middle Ages. Its heart was ancient. William the Conqueror had walked those streets 1,000 years before he crossed the Channel in the opposite direction to invade England. There was a castle there, and an abbey, and narrow streets that had witnessed Normans and Plantagenets, French kings and English invasions. It was the kind of place that seemed almost permanent, settled into the landscape so deeply that it must surely remain unchanged forever. But change was coming. In the wheat fields around Caen, in the Bocage with its thick hedgerows and its sunken lanes, something was gathering. The Waffen-SS, the military arm of the Nazi Party, the most feared soldiers in all of Europe, men who had been taught that loyalty and devotion and the willingness to die meant more than mercy or doubt or the ordinary human reluctance to kill, were positioned in defensive lines all through the Norman countryside. They had been training for this moment since the French surrender in 1940. They knew the land. They had prepared it. They had dug anti-tank ditches. planted mines in patterns they had memorized, built fortifications in fields and hedgerows that were now as familiar to them as the streets of their own towns. Yet they could not stop what was coming. No one could. The mist over Normandy in those final hours before dawn was a mist that covered not just the fields and the roads and the ancient city of Caen, but also the future itself. It covered the weeks of fighting that would come. It covered the rubble that Caen would become. It covered the 7 weeks of siege and bombardment and desperate defense and costly failure that would follow. It covered all of it, obscuring it from view, holding it in suspension in the darkness and the hum of distant engines. If you wish to walk with us through those 7 weeks of ruin, to follow the true and intricate history of the Waffen-SS at Caen and the catastrophe that unfolded there in the summer of 1944, a history of young men shaped by ideology into soldiers, of desperate defense and overwhelming assault, of a city that was meant to fall in hours but instead endured, please consider subscribing to this channel so that you might return to this long, patient excavation of that particular tragedy whenever you wish. For now, though, we remain in that mist. We remain in those final hours before the light. The wheat fields are still quiet. The mist is still rising. And somewhere out beyond the horizon, across the channel that has been crossed and recrossed so many times in history, the vast machinery of invasion is moving closer. The hum is growing, the darkness is complete, and in that darkness, suspended between what was and what is about to be, the countryside of Normandy waits, patient and eternal, and utterly unknowing of the weeks of ruin that are about to fall upon it like rain. The night deepens, the mist thickens, and something is coming across the water that will change this landscape forever. What you're about to follow is a history that unfolds slowly, deliberately, across 7 weeks in the summer of 1944. The story of Caen is not one of quick victory or swift collapse, but rather of grinding persistence, of soil turned again and again, of a city that became almost a riddle that neither side could quite solve until time itself became the arbiter. If you've ever wondered what it might feel like to stay within a long historical narrative, to move through its complexities and contradictions without rush, to sit with the weight of consequence and human choice as it accumulates day by day, then you may wish to subscribe to follow us through these 7 weeks of ruin. What begins as a place name on a map, a medieval city in Lower Normandy, perhaps familiar to you from history books or documentary footage, becomes through our telling a landscape of choice, error, resilience, and transformation. For those who prefer to return to lengthy historical explorations over time, rather than consuming them all at once, subscribing ensures you can follow this narrative whenever the evening calls for it, continuing from where you left yourself the night before, drifting deeper into the story's unfolding logic. The 7 weeks we're about to traverse together began, in a sense, long before June of 1944. They began when men chose ideology over conscience, when youth were shaped into instruments, when defensive preparations were laid out across a landscape that would soon become contested ground. They began in training camps and in philosophical movements that stretched back years into German and European history, but they crystallized in a single location, at a single moment, when 2 great military forces collided over a city that had stood for centuries. Caen itself didn't know that it was about to become the focal point of one of the war's most bitter struggles. The civilians who walked its streets, who attended its markets and its churches, had no particular sense that their summer would be stolen from them, that the walls around them would crumble, that their cellars would become refuges, and their memories would become permanently altered by fire and chaos and the sounds of machines tearing through stone. Perhaps you're drawn to understanding how such moments come to pass. How does a defensive line form? What happens when trained soldiers meet prepared defenses? How do young men respond to the weight of actual combat, as opposed to the drills and propaganda that preceded it. How do civilians endure? These are the questions that inhabit the 7 weeks of Caen's trial, and they're asked not in the abstract, but through specific units, specific orders, specific moments where human beings made decisions that rippled outward across entire landscapes of consequence. The history we're about to enter together is one documented by primary sources, by veterans' testimonies, by military records and local accounts, by the slow, careful work of historians who have pieced together what happened street by street, day by day. Yet it's also a history that invites contemplation, because beneath the facts lie the deeper questions about choice, about loyalty, about how institutions shape individuals, and about what remains when the guns finally fall silent. If you're the kind of listener who finds value in being able to pause a long narrative, to absorb it in measured portions, to return again and again to a story that rewards that kind of sustained attention, then subscribing to follow this history of Caen makes particular sense. The 7 weeks don't rush to their conclusion. They unfold with the pace of actual military operations, which is to say they accumulate, they plateau, they surge, they stall. There are moments of terrible clarity and moments of confusion. There are victories that feel hollow and losses that resonate with unexpected poignancy. There are tactical decisions made in headquarters that result in deaths in hedgerows that officers never witness. There are young soldiers experiencing combat for the first time, and experienced commanders facing situations that don't quite fit their expectations or their training. The story of Caen and of the Waffen-SS divisions that fought to hold it is fundamentally a story about how fortunes turn. At the beginning of these 7 weeks, the German army still held the initiative in many theatres. They were defending their own territory in a sense, or at least the territory they had conquered and occupied. They had prepared defences and they had concentrated force. Yet by the end of these 7 weeks, the initiative had shifted, the encirclement was forming, and the question was no longer whether the Allies would break through, but how quickly and at what cost. That transformation, that pivot from one strategic reality to another, is worth following carefully, worth sitting with, worth understanding not as abstraction, but as a series of choices and consequences that ultimately determined the fate of millions of people. The men who fought in these 7 weeks left behind letters, wrote memoirs, gave interviews decades after the events themselves. Some survived and some did not. Those who survived carried with them the weight of what they had witnessed and done. Many expressed, in later life, a complexity of feeling, pride in their professional competence, regret about the broader cause they had served, confusion about their own role in events they understood only partially. These are the human textures that we'll encounter as we move through the narrative together. Not glorification, not condemnation alone, but a careful, thoughtful accounting of how people behaved when circumstances pressed upon them, when institutions demanded obedience, when their own training and indoctrination confronted the reality of warfare and its costs. As you settle into this long historical narrative, as you perhaps prepare to follow it over multiple evenings, returning each time to move further into the story of these 7 weeks, consider that what you're about to hear is designed to move at the pace of genuine learning and contemplation. The details matter, the names matter, the specific locations matter, because geography shaped the tactical possibilities available to both sides. The weather mattered, the condition of roads and hedges and water barriers mattered, the state of ammunition supplies and fuel reserves mattered. All of these particulars will unfold gently as the narrative progresses, building a 3-dimensional understanding of what occurred, rather than a simplified summary. For those seeking that kind of depth, that kind of historical immersion, subscribing ensures you won't lose the thread, that you can return to where you left off, that you can absorb the story's complexities at your own contemplative pace. Now, having invited you to join us across these 7 weeks, Let us turn our attention to the city itself, to Caen in its strategic moment, to understand why two great military forces were willing to bleed so profusely for its possession and control. In the years before the war, as planners in Berlin and in London alike studied the coast of Normandy, a particular city rose again and again in their calculations, marked on maps with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for capitals and great ports. That city was Caen, and to understand why it mattered so much, you must first imagine the landscape as it appeared in those spring months of 1944, when the invasion was still only weeks away. Caen lies perhaps 10 to 15 kilometers inland from the Norman coast, seated in a shallow valley where the Orne and Odon rivers wind their way north toward the sea. To the south and west of the city stretches terrain that would shape every battle fought across those 7 weeks. Country thick with what the French call bocage, a landscape of dense hedgerows, narrow sunken lanes, and small fields enclosed by ancient boundaries of stone and earth. Picture it as you might imagine a patchwork quilt, but one where each square is a small fortress of vegetation and stone walls, where sight lines rarely extend more than 100 meters, where armor moves with the caution of ships navigating a narrow strait. This geography alone made Caen valuable beyond measure. Any army advancing south from the beaches needed to move quickly, to push inland before German reinforcements could arrive in strength. Speed was everything. And yet the Bocage, that same dense landscape that had sheltered Norman peasants for centuries, became a trap that could slow that advance to a crawl. But Caen itself offered something different. It sat at the convergence of roads and rail lines that connected the coast to the interior of France. It was a hub. Whoever held Caen held the keys to movement across northern Normandy. Without it, any advance further inland became fragmented, difficult, dependent on pushing through hedge and stone, metre by painful metre. The planners on the Allied side understood this perfectly. In the weeks before D-Day, they studied photographs taken from aircraft, reconnaissance reports compiled with meticulous care. Caen, they concluded, should fall on the first day. Some estimates suggested that by evening on the 6th of June, British and Canadian forces would have already entered the city, secured its streets, claimed the bridges that crossed its rivers. The city was to be an objective measured in hours, not days. Perhaps you sense already the cruel gap between expectation and reality that characterizes so much of warfare. By the time Caen finally fell completely into Allied hands, it would be 43 days later, well into July, and the city itself would be transformed into something nearly unrecognizable. Why did it prove so difficult to take? Several answers present themselves, each one important to understand if we are to grasp what happened in those 7 weeks. First, there was the matter of German preparation. Though the invasion itself came as a surprise, arriving on the Norman coast rather than elsewhere along the Channel coast, the Germans had long known an invasion would come. They had months, years even, to fortify the beaches and the hinterland beyond them. Caen was chosen not only by the Allies as important, but by the Germans as well. Defences were established in the city itself. Obstacles were placed along the approaches. The natural strength of the Bocage was enhanced by deliberate fortification. But beyond these physical preparations lay something perhaps even more significant. The arrival of German reinforcements, particularly armoured formations, happened with surprising speed. The German command in Normandy, despite the confusion of D-Day itself, managed to concentrate panzer reserves toward Caen with remarkable efficiency. Within hours of the first landings, German tanks and mechanized infantry were moving toward the beaches. Within a day or two, they had begun to arrive in the area around Caen. And among these forces was the Waffen-SS, divisions that had been stationed in Normandy, or that were rushed from other theatres to defend the city. This raises a question worth pondering, as we settle deeper into the history of these 7 weeks. Did the Germans simply have such an advantage in concentration of force that they could indefinitely prevent the Allies from taking the city? The answer, somewhat surprisingly, is no. The Allies had enormous superiority in numbers overall, in air power particularly, in supplies, and in the ability to bring fresh reinforcements ashore. What happened instead was something more subtle and more tragic. The fighting around Caen became a contest of will and endurance, fought in terrain that suited neither rapid breakthrough nor decisive maneuver. It became a grinding, attritional struggle in which both sides paid a terrible price, and neither could gain a clear advantage. Consider the strategic paradox that emerged. The Bocage, which had seemed like it would slow the German response, slowed the Allied advance even more severely. The narrow lanes that connected small villages became choke points. Tank columns could not deploy across open ground because there was no open ground. Infantry had to advance by platoon and squad through hedgerows where German defenders, even in small numbers, could inflict disproportionate casualties. And yet the Allies, for all their difficulties, were slowly pushing forward. They were taking casualties, but German casualties were equally severe, and the Germans had a much smaller pool of reserves to draw upon. This was the cruel mathematics of the Normandy campaign. Caen was strategically vital to the Allies because it was a hub of communication, a point of concentration, a place from which further advances could be launched with greater speed and coordination. It was vital to the Germans for the opposite reason, because by holding it, they could delay the Allies, could keep them tied down in the Bocage, could gain time to assemble larger counterattacks. As days stretched into weeks, the question transformed. No longer was it simply, who will take Caen? Instead it became, how long can the Germans hold it, and at what cost? The city itself, sitting in its valley with its medieval streets, and its cathedral, and its population of civilians who could not leave, became a target. The Allies, unable to break through the German defenders in the open, eventually resolved to level the city itself with bombing campaigns of increasing ferocity. They would destroy the very prize they sought to claim, reducing Caen from a city to rubble, in the hope that they could force their way through the debris and broken buildings to seize it at last. This too was part of what made those 7 weeks so significant, so destructive, so worthy of remembrance. As you lie in the darkness now, imagine those first days of summer in 1944. Imagine the certainty of the Allied planners, that Caen would fall quickly, that they would be pushing far beyond it within days. Imagine the confidence of the German commanders, that they could contain this invasion, that they could drive it back into the sea. Both were partly right and partly wrong. The Allies would indeed push beyond Caen eventually, would indeed drive the Germans back, but the road there would be far longer than anyone expected, and the cost far higher, and Caen itself would become something more than a military objective. It would become a symbol of the grinding, terrible character of the Normandy campaign, of warfare not as the sweeping maneuvers of earlier centuries, but as slow, costly attrition in the hedgerows and ruins of a landscape that had never asked to become a battlefield. The SS that gathered in the hedgerows and Norman farmhouses in the spring of 1944 was not the SS of 1933, when black uniforms first marched through Berlin streets to the sound of drums. It had become something else entirely, more militarized, more desperate, and in many ways far younger than anyone might have imagined. To understand who defended Caen, we must first understand how they were made, what beliefs were hammered into their minds, and why so many of them, barely old enough to shave, would fight with a ferocity that would shock their enemies. The Waffen-SS, the armed wing of the Nazi Party's paramilitary organization, had begun as an elite guard, a small and fanatical force meant to embody the highest ideals of the regime. By the time of the Normandy invasion, however, it had swollen into a massive military apparatus, with divisions and corps scattered across Europe. Some units traced their lineage back to those early years of ideological purity, while others had been hastily assembled from conscripts, foreign volunteers, and desperate manpower levies. The distinction mattered less in the moment of battle, and more in understanding the texture of motivation that filled those young men's hearts. The training of SS recruits followed a path quite different from the regular Wehrmacht, the German army proper. Where ordinary soldiers learned military discipline and tactical proficiency, SS men received something more comprehensive and, it might be said, more corrosive. Physical training was indeed rigorous. Endurance marches, weapons drill, hand-to-hand combat. But it was woven together with a thick strand of ideological instruction. Young men sat in barracks, listening to officers explain their historical mission, their racial destiny, their role in shaping the future of Europe. They were told they were the vanguard of a new order, selected from among thousands of applicants for their physical bearing, their mental sharpness, and their capacity for absolute commitment. The youth of these soldiers cannot be overstated. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth Division that would prove so formidable around Caen, was composed almost entirely of boys born between 1926 and 1928. Many were 17 years old when they entered combat. They had spent their entire adolescence in the Hitler Youth Organization, a state-controlled system that had absorbed German boys as a matter of course since their early teens. For these young men, the ideology of Nazism was not something they had learned to question. It was the very language in which they understood the world. When they were told that they were biologically superior, destined to rule, engaged in a sacred struggle for survival against enemies bent on enslaving them, these ideas did not sound like propaganda to them. They sounded like truth. And yet, one must be careful here, in the gentle space of historical reflection, not to paint these young soldiers as either wholly zealous fanatics or innocent victims of indoctrination. They were, in reality, something far more complex and human. Many were idealists who genuinely believed they were fighting to defend their homeland. Some were simply obedient young men, shaped by discipline and authority, doing what they had been trained to do without much capacity for refusal. Others harbored doubts, or questions, or private reservations that they kept hidden even from themselves. The human mind is rarely simple, and the mind of a 17-year-old soldier is perhaps least simple of all. The divisions that gathered around Caen in the late spring of 1944 represented several different cohorts within the SS structure. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, under the command of Sepp Dietrich, a tough, barrel-chested former sergeant who had become one of the regime's most capable military commanders, consisted of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the original bodyguard division, and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Other SS units arrived as reinforcements over the following weeks, including elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, which had fought extensively in Eastern Europe and carried with it a reputation for brutality. These divisions, by the standards of the time, were exceptionally well equipped. They possessed the newest tanks, the best communications equipment, superior logistics. They were, in many ways, more generously supported than the regular German army divisions fighting around them. The ideology that bound these men together was militarized, but it was not merely military. It carried within it a profound racial component, a certainty that they were engaged in a struggle for the biological survival of their people. They were taught to see themselves as an order apart, a brotherhood bound by blood and fate. The SS oath, which every recruit swore, bound them not to the German state or to the Constitution. There was no Constitution to swear to, but to Adolf Hitler personally, and to the ideals he embodied. This created a structure of loyalty that was almost religious in its intensity. The SS man's duty was not to question orders, but to execute them with absolute dedication. One might pause here to consider what effect such training had on these young minds, particularly when it came time to perform acts that were themselves questionable or worse. How do you teach a young man to revere absolute authority, to see himself as superior to those outside his brotherhood, to view the world through the lens of existential struggle, and then expect him to behave with restraint when that authority commands cruelty? The historical record suggests that the answer is, you cannot. The ideology and the training created a psychological framework in which ordinary acts of violence could be understood as necessary, even noble. Training in the SS divisions tended to emphasize small unit tactics, rapid deployment, and aggressive counterattack. An SS platoon or company was expected to be more self-reliant than its Wehrmacht equivalent, its men better educated in the principles of warfare and capable of operating independently if necessary. Officers were selected not merely for their military competence, but for their ideological reliability. A Wehrmacht officer might be a professional soldier of the old school, a man who had served in previous wars and who viewed soldiering as a craft. An SS officer was more likely to be a political soldier, a man who saw himself as a revolutionary and who viewed the war as part of a larger transformation of European civilization. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division, which would play such a central role in the defense of Caen, was in many ways the crystallization of what the SS aspired to become. These boys, and they were for the most part genuinely boys, had never known a time without the Nazi regime. They had never had the opportunity to develop political consciousness in any system other than the totalitarian state. The Hitler Youth Organization had shaped them from early childhood, teaching them values of loyalty, obedience, physical hardness, and ideological commitment. When they joined the Waffen-SS as conscripted soldiers in 1943 and 1944, they were not being introduced to Nazism, they were being militarized within the framework of a worldview they already inhabited completely. Their commander was SS Brigadeführer Kurt Meyer, a man in his mid-30s who had earned a reputation as a tough and capable officer. Meyer believed passionately in the SS ideology and demanded absolute commitment from his men. He was not a sadist or a lunatic by the standards of military commanders of that era, but he was a thorough believer in the cause for which he was fighting. The officers and non-commissioned officers beneath him represented a cross-section of SS experience, some with years of service in Eastern Europe, others relatively new to the service. What united them was a shared sense of purpose and an absolute conviction that they were fighting a just and necessary war. As these divisions settled into their positions around Normandy in the spring of 1944, they could not have known that they were about to face the largest amphibious invasion in history, or that their resistance, however fanatical, would ultimately prove futile. What they knew was that they were elite soldiers, ideologically committed, physically trained, equipped with superior weapons, and commanded by officers who believed in their mission. They knew they were the best that their nation had to offer. And as the spring turned towards summer, as the first reports of Allied activity began to filter through the chain of command, they waited with a mixture of confidence and an almost fatalistic acceptance of what was to come. The question of motivation, what truly drove these men to fight with such desperation, would occupy historians for decades. Was it purely ideology? Or was it also the bonds of comradeship, the fear of what would happen if they retreated, the simple human reluctance to abandon one's unit in the face of overwhelming odds? The answer is almost certainly all of these things and more. Young men in combat are driven by forces that operate simultaneously at multiple levels, the political and the personal, the ideological and the intimate. To reduce their behavior to any single cause would be to misunderstand the complexity of human nature under extreme stress. What can be said with certainty is that when the moment of testing came, when the first explosions of the naval bombardment shook the Norman countryside and the first reports of landings reached SS command posts, these soldiers would respond with a dedication and ferocity that would earn them respect even from enemies who despised what they fought for. They had been trained for this moment, shaped for it, prepared for it in ways both physical and psychological. Whether one views that preparation as noble or terrible, the result would be the same. 7 weeks of some of the bitterest fighting of the entire war, centered on a medieval city that would not fall quickly or easily, despite everything that its attackers possessed. The night of June 5th held a peculiar electricity in the barracks, and bivouacs scattered through the Villers-Bocage. Radio traffic crackled in low frequencies. Telephone lines hummed with orders flowing downward through the chain of command. Whether from intuition or intelligence, some among the German officer corps sensed that the moment, long anticipated and endlessly rehearsed in imagination, was arriving at last. The Waffen-SS men, many of them still boys, if we're honest about their ages, lay in their beds or sat cleaning weapons by lamplight, some writing letters they might never send, others simply staring at nothing in particular, waiting. By 3 o'clock in the morning on June 6th, the sky over the English Channel began to transform. What had been darkness grew textured with the distant throb of aircraft engines, hundreds upon hundreds of them, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The bombers were already inland, their payloads falling on defensive positions, on roads and bridges and gun emplacements. The earth shuddered. In some places, the ground itself seemed to rise and settle like breathing. The SS men were roused from their rest, rolled from their bunks, ordered to stand to in their positions. This was it. After months of waiting, of training, of ideological indoctrination designed to shape fanaticism into a kind of military perfection, the moment had arrived with a roar that could not be ignored. But confusion, that ancient companion of warfare, had already begun its work. The initial reports filtering back to German command were fragmented, sometimes contradictory, often delayed by hours from the moment they described. Telephone lines had been cut by the preliminary bombardment. Courier motorcycles navigated roads rendered chaotic by craters and debris. One unit reported landings here, another reported landings there. Intelligence suggested a main thrust in one sector, yet the evidence pointed towards several simultaneous assaults across 100 kilometers of coastline. Was this the real invasion, or merely a feint designed to draw reserves away from the true landing zone? This uncertainty, this fog of war that no map could ever fully dispel, would color every decision made in those first hours. The SS divisions received their marching orders at different times and from different sources. Some received word directly from divisional headquarters. Others received conflicting instructions from multiple commands, each thinking itself the authority. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend, stationed near Lisieux, roughly 20 kilometers inland from Juno Beach, where the Canadians were establishing their foothold, received orders to move toward the coast. But the route was not direct. The roads, already choked with civilian traffic fleeing the bombing, had also been targeted with remarkable precision. A bridge here had been destroyed. A major road there had been reduced to rubble and crater. The division's columns moved in fits and starts, motorcycles ranging ahead to find passable routes, the Panther tanks and half-tracks grinding forward at a frustrating crawl. What must it have been like for these young men, many of them 19 or 20 years old, to feel the vibration of the engines through their bodies, to hear the occasional crack of distant artillery, to smell the smoke drifting across the countryside as their unit moved toward an enemy they could not yet see? The indoctrination had been thorough. They had been taught to believe in their cause, in the righteousness of their defense, in the inevitable triumph of will and superior training. Yet no indoctrination can fully prepare a human being for the first time they encounter actual combat. The first time they understand that the bullets and shells they hear are real and that they might be next. Further south and west, other SS formations scrambled to move north toward the invasion zone. The 2nd Panzer Corps, under General Heinrich Eberbach, began organizing its scattered elements, panzer divisions, panzer grenadier regiments, supporting artillery, into a coherent counterattack force. The plan, in theory, was sound. Concentrate armor and strike hard at the beachhead before the Allies could establish themselves firmly ashore. But here too, confusion reigned. Messages had to pass through military channels that had been disrupted by bombing. Commanders argued about priorities. Some panzer formations were held in reserve by higher authority, their movement restricted pending clarification of where the main Allied assault would occur. The principle of concentration, so essential to successful armoured warfare, was being undermined by the same fog of war that made every report suspect. In the towns and villages around Caen, civilians emerged from shelters and cellars where they had sheltered during the night's bombardment. The ancient capital of Normandy had not been heavily bombed, not yet, but the surrounding countryside bore the marks of Allied aircraft. Roads were torn, fields were scarred with craters, and the air itself seemed contaminated with the smell of cordite and burning oil. Some civilians began spontaneously evacuating south and west, away from the coast, clogging the very roads that the German military needed for its counterattack. Here was a friction of war that no amount of planning could fully eliminate. The movement of soldiers and tanks and supplies required clear roads, yet the very violence that had triggered the invasion was driving civilians to flee in the opposite direction. By dawn, as the first light began to creep across the Norman landscape, the nature of the invasion became clearer to German eyes. This was no feint. This was the real thing. Multiple corps landing simultaneously across a wide front, supported by devastating air power, covered by naval gunfire from ships that the German military could not reach. The intelligence services had misjudged the timing and the location. They had expected the invasion to come in the Pas-de-Calais, farther north and east. They had not fully accounted for the sheer scale of what was now unfolding. Within hours, hundreds of thousands of men and millions of tons of supplies would pour ashore across the 5 designated beach sectors. The SS units, trained and ideologically committed though they were, found themselves reacting rather than dictating. The smooth, coordinated response that military planning had envisioned was already fragmenting under the pressure of events. Some formations would take hours longer to reach the coast than anticipated. Others would arrive in the fighting piecemeal, thrown into battle before they could be properly concentrated. The advantage of the defender, the ability to choose the ground and prepare the defences, was being offset by the advantage of the attacker, the element of surprise, the overwhelming weight of material and air support, the freedom to choose when and where to land. Consider for a moment the perspective of a junior SS officer receiving the order to move his company toward the invasion zone. He has been trained to execute orders without question, to believe in the superiority of his unit, to trust in the ideology that justified their military existence. Yet he is also intelligent enough to understand, perhaps not consciously, but at some level of recognition, that what is happening this day is unlike anything in his previous experience. The roar of aircraft that never stops, the flash of artillery far distant but drawing closer, the roads in chaos, the rumours beginning to whisper through the ranks. How many men had landed? How well equipped were they? How much support did they have? Where would the crucial blow fall? As the sun climbed higher on the morning of June 6th, the SS divisions and regiments in Normandy began to converge on the invasion zones. But the convergence was slow, hindered by damage to infrastructure, hampered by the continuing air bombardment, constrained by the need to move cautiously through a landscape now contested by enemy fighter bombers. What should have been a rapid, decisive response was becoming a race against time, a desperate attempt to build a sufficient concentration of force before the Allies broke out from their narrow beachheads. In this race, already, the Germans were beginning to lose ground. They did not yet realize they had surrendered. The June light in Normandy, when it breaks through the morning cloud, falls at an angle that seems to hesitate. It catches on the stone walls. And it was into this landscape, this ancient patchwork of narrow lanes and high hedges and small orchards where apple trees had stood for generations, that the first real collisions of the war in the West began to take shape. Not in grand formations or sweeping maneuvers, but in the small, violent spaces where men could see one another's faces. The bocage, the word itself carries the weight of what it was. A landscape of bocage, a Norman term for the dense hedging and timber boundaries that divided the countryside into 1,000 small compartments, each one slightly higher than the last, each one a natural fortress waiting to be used. A tank that could turn and maneuver across open ground became almost helpless here. A soldier advancing across a field could find himself suddenly confined to a lane where fire came from above, from behind stone walls, from windows in farmhouses he had not even known were there. The terrain itself had become a weapon, and the Waffen-SS units beginning to arrive at these narrow approaches would understand this almost at once, even if their initial movements were confused and reactive. On the morning of June 6th, the SS divisions stationed in Normandy, the 12th SS Hitler Jugend, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, scattered Panzer Grenadier units, had received their first alerts some hours after the beaches themselves had already begun their transformation into landing grounds. Confusion was not uncommon in war. Communication was fragmentary. But within hours, the first convoys began to move toward the sounds of gunfire, and by the afternoon of that first day, SS Panzer Grenadiers and their attached armor were making their initial contact with Canadian and British forces who had pushed inland from the coast. These early skirmishes had a particular character. The Waffen-SS units, despite their training and their discipline, were meeting an enemy they could not yet fully see or understand. The terrain broke up every attempt at coordinated assault. A company of infantry moving along a hedged lane might encounter a Sherman tank hidden behind a stone wall, or Canadian riflemen dug into a sunken road where their muzzles could barely be seen. There was a hedgerow war within the larger war, and it demanded a different kind of fighting altogether, less about grand maneuver and more about control of each small piece of ground, each orchard, each farm cottage. What compelled the SS units forward, despite these difficulties? Part of it was training, certainly. The fanaticism for which the Waffen-SS would become so infamous did play a role, even in these confused first encounters. But there was also something else, a kind of momentum created by command, by orders that had come down from above, by the simple fact that when you are told to move toward the enemy, you move. The terrain slowed everything, but it did not stop it entirely. By the end of the first day, small victories and small defeats had already been recorded in places whose names would soon become grim reminders. Caen itself, where SS units attempted to move into the city and found themselves halted. Saint-Lô, where fighting became almost hand-to-hand around individual buildings. Villers-Bocage, not yet the site of its more famous clash, but already showing its character as a place where armor and infantry would struggle against the landscape as much as against one another. The bocage demanded a new kind of infantry tactic. A man could not simply run across open ground. The hedges and walls forced him to move along the lanes, to fight through the gaps, to clear each small field and each copse as if it were a fortress. And the Waffen-SS soldiers, for all their training, were sometimes as confused by this as their enemies were. Some accounts from those early days speak of SS units becoming disorganized as they tried to navigate terrain that permitted no clear sight lines, no spaces for the kind of massed formations they had been trained to use. And yet, despite this, they held. They dug in. They prevented the rapid inland drive that the Allies had hoped for in those first days after the landing. In many of these early encounters, the sheer density of fire that the Allies could bring to bear, the naval gunfire from the ships still offshore, the air support, the machine guns mounted on armored vehicles, should have overwhelmed the SS units quickly. Yet there was something almost stubborn in their resistance, whether this was courage or ideology, or simply that they had been ordered to hold and understood that retreat was not an option. The historical record does not always make entirely clear. Perhaps it was all of these things together, bound up in the moment of collision between two forces in a landscape neither of them had fully anticipated. Some historians have noted that these first skirmishes in the Bocage were almost a kind of mirror image of what would come later. Early German counterattacks, desperate and often hastily organized, surged forward and were met with withering fire, then fell back. Allied forces pressed forward, gained ground in some areas, encountered unexpected resistance in others. By the end of the first week, the pattern was already establishing itself. Not breakthrough, not swift victory for either side, but rather a slow grinding forward, measured in hundreds of yards, paid for in lives accumulating like the hedges themselves, layer upon layer. There is something almost dreamlike about reading accounts of these early days, when neither side quite knew what they were doing in this landscape, when orders from above often made little sense when confronted with the actual terrain, when a village 3 miles inland seemed to take 3 days to secure. The wheat was beginning to ripen in the fields between the hedges. The orchards were full of young fruit, and men were dying in these small compartments of green, often unable to see the people who were killing them, often unable to see very far at all beyond the next wall, the next lane, the next invisible enemy position. The fog of war, that phrase we use so easily in speaking of military history, took on an almost literal quality in the Bocage. Mist hung in the low places in the morning. Dust rose from the roads and hung in the narrow lanes. Smoke drifted from burning vehicles and burning buildings, and in this murk, small units fought for small pieces of ground, and orders were given and sometimes executed and sometimes ignored, because by the time they arrived, they had already become irrelevant to the situation on the ground. What emerges from these early skirmishes, when one reads the detailed accounts, the regimental histories, the individual soldier testimonies, the after-action reports filed by both sides, is not a sense of dramatic military genius or strategic brilliance, but rather a sense of two opposing forces, both somewhat confused, both discovering that this particular corner of France was not going to yield quickly to conventional military tactics. The Bocage, it turned out, favoured defence. It always had, and the Waffen-SS units, arriving as reinforcements and attempting to push back the invasion, found themselves suddenly very grateful for terrain that made every advance costly and every defensive position a kind of natural fortress. The individual dramas of these first skirmishes, the tank that ran out of fuel in a narrow lane, the squad of infantry that found itself suddenly outflanked by an enemy it could not see, the radio operator trying to call for artillery support but unable to describe where the enemy actually was. All of these accumulated into something like a pattern. The war was slowing down. It was becoming a war of inches, and in many ways, this characterization would define the next 7 weeks, beginning right here, in these first collisions in the hedge-road countryside around Caen. By June 8th or 9th, the Waffen-SS units had already established a line of sorts, not continuous, but existing, defined by the terrain as much as by military planning. It ran north and south, a kind of barrier between the coast and the interior. And on the other side of this line, The Allies were already beginning to understand that the swift victory they had anticipated was not going to be swift at all. The Bocage had transformed the war into something different, something slower, something that would demand weeks of fighting for a city that was supposed to fall in hours. And so the rhythm of these early days established itself. A tentative probe, a collision in a narrow space, a stalemate, a slow repositioning of forces, another tentative probe. The hedges themselves seemed to grow in the heat as the days passed. The dust from the roads clung to everything. And neither side had yet quite grasped how long this war within the larger war would actually last. How many small skirmishes would be fought in how many small compartments of green before Caen itself would finally fall, and the Bocage would finally give way to something more open, something that might allow for movement again. Among those who gathered in the Norman hedgerows lay a division unlike any other, the 12,000-strong men of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth Division, whose average age at D-Day was barely 19 years old. To understand them is to understand something troubling and human at once, how ideology, early training, and the machinery of war could transform schoolboys into soldiers of remarkable discipline and ferocity. Many had been born around 1925, children of the Weimar years, shaped entirely within the Nazi educational system from age 10 onward. The Hitler Youth Organization had been compulsory since 1936, which meant that nearly every boy in this division had spent his formative years in paramilitary camps, rifle ranges, and ideological instruction, learning to see themselves not as individuals, but as cells in a vast, unified organism. The 12th SS was formed in the spring of 1943, drawing together these young men who had already served in the Hitler Youth's military wing. They underwent intensive training in occupied France itself, drilling in the very Bocage and Norman villages they would later defend. Their commander, Brigade Führer Kurt Meyer, a man in his early 30s, battle-hardened and coldly competent, shaped them with ruthless precision. Witnesses would later remember his methods as nearly cult-like in their intensity. He would speak to them not of strategy or survival, but of honor, of the sacredness of their cause, of the necessity to fight to the last man. Meyer embodied a particular strain of SS fanaticism, educated, articulate, genuinely believing in the worldview he preached. He did not simply command obedience. He cultivated a kind of reverent loyalty. What made this division formidable, in the first weeks at least, was not merely ideology, but training and youth itself. A boy of 18 possesses a nervous system still plastic, still forming, capable of absorbing stress and fear in ways perhaps different from older men. These soldiers had been drilled relentlessly in small unit tactics, in the use of the Panzerfaust and MG-42 machine gun, in the coordination of armor and infantry. They had been taught that hesitation was shame, that retreat was betrayal. And yet, for all their preparation, nothing truly readies a human being for the reality of industrial warfare. We might pause on this paradox. A generation of youths trained almost from childhood to embrace death in service of a totalizing ideology, now facing, for many, their first true combat. In those first days after June 6th, the Hitlerjugend division was positioned north and east of Caen, and they were among the first SS formations to move toward the beaches. Accounts from both Allied and German soldiers speak of their eagerness to engage, their willingness to launch counterattacks that officers with more experience might have considered reckless. This was not cowardice avoiding itself as courage, but rather the effect of their entire socialization. They had been taught that attack was honor, defense was concession, surrender was death in any meaningful sense. Some historians suggest that this aggressive posture, deployed against the more cautious and deliberately methodical Canadians and British in the early weeks, gave the Germans temporary advantage. Youthful energy and fanatic commitment, when channeled through proper military discipline, can create a dangerous intensity. And yet the transformation from boys into killers was neither instantaneous nor complete. Letters and diaries recovered after the war suggest that many of these young men experienced profound cognitive dissonance in their first weeks of combat. They had been told that they fought for the survival of their race, that they were warriors in a cosmic struggle. The reality they encountered was narrower and more immediate. The smell of burning fuel, the screams of wounded men, the sight of comrades torn apart by shrapnel, the cold calculation required to kill another human being at close range. Some rose to this horror with a kind of grim acceptance. Others seemed to fracture internally, carrying out their orders while gradually losing whatever ideological fervor had sustained them. There is a particular sadness in considering the boy soldiers of the Hitler-Jugend division, and it is worth sitting with that sadness for a moment. These were not demons, despite what propagandists on both sides sometimes suggested. They were young men, many of them conscripted into the Hitler Youth as children, offered no real choice about their indoctrination, their training, their eventual deployment. Many would not survive the summer. Of those who did, many would spend decades afterward trying to reconcile their youthful selves with what they had done, what they had witnessed, what they had believed. The question of moral responsibility becomes more complex, not simpler, when one considers that these soldiers had been shaped by their society from infancy, denied the ordinary freedoms and choices that might have allowed them to develop independent judgment. The 12th SS would hold portions of the Bocage with a tenacity that confounded Allied commanders. In one engagement near the village of Rauray, they counterattacked repeatedly, accepting enormous casualties rather than yield ground. A Canadian officer later remarked that they fought like men who believed they had nowhere else to go, no future except in victory or death. He was not wrong. By the ideology they had been taught, surrender was annihilation, and if they could not win, then at least they could drag down as many enemies as possible in their final struggle. It was a mathematics of despair, though they did not yet know despair was the only outcome available to them. As the weeks passed, and the battle for Caen stretched on, the youthful exuberance of the Hitler-Jugend division began to wear away, replaced by exhaustion and a grinding competence born of brutal repetition. They learned to dig better, to position their anti-tank weapons more effectively, to coordinate their attacks with armor and supporting fire. They also learned to fear, not cowardly fear, but the clear-eyed understanding that death was not a heroic abstraction, but a very real possibility waiting in the next hedgerow. Some of the survivors' accounts suggest a kind of maturity, arriving far too quickly, a loss of childhood, not in gentle increments but in violent ruptures. What is perhaps most unsettling about the 12th SS is that they were effective soldiers despite, or perhaps because of, their youth and indoctrination. They did not win in Normandy. Ultimately, no amount of courage or fanaticism could overcome the material superiority and strategic clarity of the Allies, but they slowed the advance significantly. They inflicted casualties far beyond their own numbers in the first weeks. They embodied, in their strange way, the terrible efficiency of a totalitarian system at converting human beings into military instruments. This is not to excuse their actions, which would come to include episodes of brutality that reflected not merely military necessity, but the murderous ideology they carried with them. It is rather to understand that the 12th SS Hitler-Jugend Division stands as a monument to something deeply troubling about modernity itself. How quickly, how thoroughly, ordinary young people can be reshaped into something harder and more lethal, and how little resistance they often mount to that transformation, because they have been trained from childhood to believe their own erasure is a form of glory. And so they moved through the Norman summer, these teenagers, their boyish faces growing harder, as June turned to July, as the hedgerows around them accumulated more and more wreckage, more and more names of the fallen. Some would wonder, years later, how they had survived at all, or whether some part of them had wished they had not. And so we turn now to a darker hour, one that sits uneasily in the record of those 7 weeks, a moment where the noise of battle quietened into something else entirely, something that historians approach with solemn care and measured language, for the dead cannot speak to defend themselves, and the living who witnessed what unfolded at a place called Ardennes Abbey have left us only fragments, contradictions, and the weight of silence. It was in the middle days of June, perhaps the 12th or thereabouts, when the fighting around the Villers-Bocage had already begun to assume its grinding character, that members of the 12th SS Hitler Jugend Division, those young men we spoke of earlier, soldiers barely old enough to shave, found themselves in possession of Canadian prisoners of war. The abbey itself stood as a place of refuge, and also, as it would turn out, a place where the ordinary rules of warfare would be broken, though the exact sequence of what happened there remains contested even now, even with all our historical hindsight, even with all our archives and testimonies carefully preserved. What we know with reasonable certainty is this: somewhere between 16 and 20 Canadian soldiers, captured during the fighting near the village of Ardennes, were brought to the abbey grounds, likely as prisoners being held temporarily before transfer to a proper prisoner of war facility further back. The abbey itself was not a military installation in any formal sense. It was a monastery, a place consecrated to prayer and contemplation, though by 1944 it had become, like so much of Normandy, simply one more building caught in the machinery of war. The accounts that came afterward, gathered from survivors and from the soldiers of various units who were in the vicinity, paint a picture of profound and deliberate violence. Canadian prisoners were said to have been executed, shot in cold blood rather than held or transferred, their bodies left on the abbey grounds or buried hastily in its gardens. The number of victims remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest fewer, others more. The exact perpetrators, the specific officers involved, whether this was ordered from above or rose from the brutal momentum of young, exhausted, ideologically fervent soldiers, these details have never been fully untangled. What makes this moment so difficult to examine, what requires us to speak with such careful precision, is that we must acknowledge several competing truths simultaneously. First, there is substantial eyewitness testimony from Canadian soldiers, both those who died and whose comrades found them, and from other observers, British and Canadian alike, who documented the aftermath. Second, there is the nature of the 12th SS Hitler Jugend Division itself, which we have discussed. These were not conscripts in the ordinary sense, but volunteers steeped in Nazi ideology from childhood, trained to view their enemies as subhuman, taught that mercy was weakness. Third, there is the documented pattern of war crimes committed by various units of the Waffen-SS across Europe, a pattern so extensive that it cannot be dismissed as isolated aberration. Yet we must also note with similar honesty that after the war, a French court investigated the Ardennes Abbey killings, and some of those investigated were acquitted for lack of sufficient proof, while others confessed but claimed they were following orders, or that prisoners were killed while attempting to escape, or that the killing was done by other units in confusion. The fog of war, which clouds so much of what happened in the Bocage, clouds this moment too. Consider for a moment the psychological state of these young soldiers. They had been fighting for days, in terrain that seemed designed to nullify every advantage of their superior training. They were losing men, comrades they had trained alongside, grown to know. To enemy fire they could barely see, from hedgerow to hedgerow, from farmhouse to farmhouse. They were exhausted, they were frightened, though their ideology forbade them from admitting fear. They had been taught that the Anglo-Saxon enemy was attempting to enslave their nation, to destroy their people, that surrender was dishonor, and then they found themselves holding prisoners, men they had been taught to despise. What we can say with confidence is that soldiers died at Ardennes Abbey who should not have died, at least not in the manner that they did. What we can say is that this event became part of the historical record, investigated after the war, acknowledged by historians, entered into the collective memory of those who fought and suffered in Normandy. What remains harder to say with absolute certainty is exactly who ordered what, exactly whose finger pulled which trigger, exactly whether this was an expression of careful military policy or a brutal act born of exhaustion and ideology and the dehumanizing pressure of combat. And perhaps that uncertainty itself is part of what we must sit with as we contemplate this dark chapter. War crimes are often not neat or fully explicable. They often emerge from a tangle of factors: systemic dehumanization, military necessity pressed to extremes, the loss of moral restraint in young men subject to violence. The Ardennes Abbey killings fit this pattern. They do not stand alone in the history of the Second World War, neither in terms of the actions of the Waffen-SS, nor in terms of war crimes broadly. Yet each instance deserves its own witness, its own careful examination. The bodies were eventually exhumed, identified where possible, given proper burial. The families of those killed received notification. Years after the war ended, memorials were constructed, investigations took place. Some men faced trial, some were convicted, some walked free. The abbey itself was rebuilt, as so much of Normandy was rebuilt, returned to its purpose as a place of prayer, though the ground beneath it carried the memory of those graves. And the fighting continued. Just days later, the battle for Caen would intensify. Fresh German units arrived. The siege deepened. The Bocage would yield more blood, both Canadian and German, both civilian and soldier. The moment of the abbey would become one dark strand in the larger tapestry of 7 weeks of ruin, remembered not with any sense of finality or closure, but with the kind of sober acknowledgement that comes when we realize that history contains acts we must remember, precisely because they challenge us to think carefully about how war unmakes the ordinary rules by which civilized people live. In those first desperate hours after the beaches had been seized, when the sun had barely crested the Norman coast and the sound of gunfire still echoed across the dunes like distant thunder, the commanders of the British Second Army held a conviction that would prove as fragile as morning mist over the Channel. They believed, or perhaps they needed to believe, that Caen could be taken quickly. The city lay only a few kilometers inland from the beaches, where the Canadians and British forces had come ashore, close enough that one might imagine riding through its ancient streets by nightfall, close enough that the strategic planners in their tents and command vehicles had drawn their lines on maps with the confidence of men who had not yet felt the weight of true resistance. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Operation Perch, as it would come to be known, was designed to hook around Caen from the west, to send armoured and mechanized columns inland in a sweeping movement that would encircle the city and force its surrender, or at worst, compress its defences until they buckled under pressure. The idea had merit. The bocage beyond the beaches, with its dense hedgerows and sunken lanes, was difficult terrain for rapid movement, yes, but it was also terrain that heavy armour could eventually push through, terrain that would yield to numbers and determination. What the planners had not fully accounted for, what no amount of intelligence briefing could quite communicate, was the peculiar quality of desperation that grips men who know they are losing, men who have been trained since boyhood to hold ground until the last bullet, until the last breath. The Canadians, moving inland from their sector near Juno Beach, advanced with caution born of hard experience in other campaigns. They were good soldiers, disciplined and brave, but they moved through terrain that seemed almost designed by nature to frustrate rapid movement. Every hedgerow was a potential fortress. Every sunken lane could hide an anti-tank gun. Every orchard concealed German soldiers who had orders to make the advance costly, to buy time, to extract a price in blood for every meter of ground surrendered. And the Germans, though fewer in number than the Allies might have hoped, and though their larger formations were still assembling from across Normandy, were skilled at this kind of desperate defence. They knew the ground. They had had months to fortify it, to understand its strengths and weaknesses, to plan where they would make their stands. Consider the paradox that often emerges in warfare, that strange inversion where careful planning meets the chaos of contact with an enemy who has no intention of cooperating with your timeline. The British and Canadian commanders had assumed they would encounter a beaten enemy, disorganized and retreating. What they found instead, as the first days of June wore on into the second and third weeks of the invasion, was an enemy that seemed to stiffen its resistance precisely where it mattered most. The Germans could not stop the landings, that battle had been lost on the beaches, could make the inland advance a grinding, attritional nightmare. They could trade ground for time, space for casualties, and in doing so, they could prevent the rapid breakthrough that the Allies desperately needed. Operation Perch itself began in the second week of June, when the British and Canadian forces felt they had secured enough beachhead to launch a coordinated push toward the city. The vision was clear enough. Drive west and then north. Encircle Caen, cut off its defenders, and force a decision. But from the very first moments of the operation, things began to unravel in the thousand small ways that military plans tend to do when they encounter reality. The terrain was worse than expected. The German resistance was more organized. The weather, never reliable in Normandy, turned foul and made the already difficult movement even slower. Tanks bogged down in the hedgerows. Infantry companies became separated from their parent units. Communication, always fragile in the chaos of battle, became nearly impossible. One might wonder, in the quiet of contemplation, whether the commanders who conceived Perch understood how fundamentally different this kind of warfare was from the grand maneuvers of previous campaigns. The Bocage was not France's rolling farmland. It was not a place where armor could sweep in broad arcs and crush resistance. It was a place where every advantage of technology and numbers became diluted and fragmented. A man with a Panzerfaust, that crude but devastatingly effective anti-tank weapon, could hold up an entire armored column simply by forcing the tanks to button up, to slow their movement, to call for infantry support. And in that slowing, in that necessary caution, the enemy gained the most precious resource of all, time. The Canadian forces pushing toward Caen from the east found themselves grinding through this nightmare of vegetation and narrow passages, losing men steadily to snipers and ambushes, slowed not by an enemy they could see, but by the landscape itself, which seemed to conspire with the German defenders. The pace of advance, which was supposed to be measured in the broad sweeps of armor, instead became measured in the slow, painful feat gained by infantry working through each hedgerow in turn. Villages that should have been bypassed became focal points of bitter fighting. Crossroads that the planners had expected to seize in passing became objectives that took days and cost far more than expected. The British forces, operating from other sectors, attempted their own drives toward the city, and they too discovered the same awful truth that their Canadian allies were learning, that the confident predictions of rapid breakthrough had encountered a foe that would not cooperate with such optimism. Panzer units, though still arriving piecemeal from other parts of Normandy, managed to position themselves across the likely axes of advance. German defenders, though increasingly sparse, seemed to have an uncanny ability to materialize in exactly the right place at the right time. to deliver fire that was just disciplined and well aimed enough to force the Allies to develop their attacks slowly and methodically. What happened over the course of Operation Perch was not a catastrophic defeat, but rather something more insidious, a slow erosion of the timetable, a steady gnawing away at the assumption that Caen could be taken quickly. Day followed day. The casualty lists grew. Tank after tank was knocked out in the narrow lanes, sometimes by anti-tank guns, sometimes by mobile 88mm anti-aircraft guns repurposed for ground defense, sometimes by simple mines that had been seeded across the likely routes of advance. The infantry, forced to move slowly and carefully through the hedgerows, suffered casualties from German machine guns and from the artillery that the Germans, despite their overall shortage of ammunition, seemed able to concentrate at precisely the right moments. By the end of the first week of Perch, it was becoming clear to the commanders that they would not be entering Caen in triumph on a timetable drawn up in the planning tents. The city was not going to fall to a quick strike. The Germans had not broken. Their discipline had held. New reinforcements were arriving, particularly the Panzer Lehr Division and elements of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, and with these reinforcements came a stiffening of the defense that made the task of the Allies immeasurably more difficult. What had been envisioned as a rapid maneuver was becoming a siege, a grinding attritional campaign in which the British and Canadian forces would have to push forward metre by metre, paying in blood for every small gain. The question that began to haunt the command posts was whether the rapid breakthrough that everyone had hoped for was ever really possible. Perhaps, in retrospect, the assumption that a well-trained and well-led enemy would simply fold under the weight of an invasion was always too optimistic. Perhaps the Bocage itself, that ancient landscape of stone walls and dense vegetation, was itself a kind of fortress that no amount of armor could overcome quickly. Perhaps the price of victory in Normandy was always going to be higher than the planners had predicted, the timeline longer, the suffering more intense. As the days of Perch stretched into weeks, and as the stalemate around Caen began to crystallize into a kind of grinding standoff, the reality of what the Allies faced became clearer. They had landed successfully, they had secured a beachhead, but the enemy they faced, trained, disciplined, and fighting in terrain that favored defense, would not simply evaporate before superior numbers and technology. The war in Normandy would not be won in days. It would be won in weeks of bitter, attritional fighting, in sacrifices that would transform the ancient city of Caen into a symbol of both invasion and suffering, of victory purchased at a terrible cost. The roads converging on Normandy from the south and east had begun to fill with the weight of German armoured resolve, though the journey itself became a gauntlet of air attack and fragmentation. Panzer Lehr, the mechanized teaching division that had trained in Hungary on the latest tank innovations, began its ponderous movement northward toward the sound of Allied guns, and what should have been a march measured in days would consume nearly 2 weeks of constant bombardment and harassment from the sky. One might pause to consider how differently that division arrived at Caen compared to how it had been promised, delayed, worn, its fuel reserves already compromised by the systematic strangulation of the French rail network and the roads themselves. The Panzer Lehr was no hastily assembled militia. It represented some of the most advanced thinking in German armor tactics, its crews selected and trained with meticulous care, its officers versed in maneuver and combined arms at a level that would trouble Allied commanders for weeks to come. Its Panther tanks, with their sloped armor and powerful guns, would prove formidable opponents in the close, grinding combat of the Bocage, and its Panzer Grenadiers, mechanized infantry riding in half-tracks and armored personnel carriers, embodied a professionalism that contrasted sharply with hastily committed forces. Yet, as these vehicles rumbled northward, Visibility from the skies grew perilous by the hour, and many crews found themselves moving at night, navigating by moonlight and the occasional flash of distant artillery, seeking any concealment the Norman roads could offer. Meanwhile, additional SS reinforcements were trickling into the sector around Caen, though not without considerable friction and delay. The Das Reich Division, cycling northward from Aquitaine, would not reach the engagement zone for some weeks yet, its journey a nightmare of ambush and sabotage by French resistance fighters. Each bridge a potential catastrophe, each tunnel a place of vulnerability. But other SS units, smaller in scale but potent in effect, were being fed into the battle piecemeal. SS Panzer Grenadier formations, heavy tank companies with their Tigers and Panthers, and anti-tank troops equipped with the feared Panzerfaust, a weapon that would prove devastating in the close quarters of village fighting. The SS possessed an institutional fanaticism that made them, in many respects, the most reliable defenders the German High Command could commit, even as it made them, in the judgment of history, something altogether more sinister. The arrival of these fresh forces altered the calculus of the British and Canadian offensive almost at once, though the change was not immediately apparent in the fog of battle. Where once it had seemed that Caen might fall to swift assault, the deepening of the defense suggested that something far more protracted was taking shape. Supply lines for these new units had to be established, ammunition dumps created or relocated to safety, command posts organized amid the rubble and the dense hedgerows. The SS officers and NCOs, many of them veterans of earlier campaigns in Poland, Russia, and the Balkans, brought with them an experience in defensive warfare that could not be easily overcome by numerical superiority or courage alone. One observes, when studying the arrival of these reinforcements, a certain tragic irony in their deployment. The Waffen-SS divisions being committed to Normandy were, in many cases, among the last best hope of the German war effort, and yet they were being spent in a battle that, from a strategic perspective, was already unwinnable. The Allies possessed air superiority so complete that movement by day became nearly suicidal, yet the demands of defending Caen meant that movement had to occur, and troops had to be positioned regardless of the risk. The attrition began not in dramatic clashes of armor, but in the slow, patient destruction wrought by fighter bombers and artillery, each day peeling away men and machines from units that could not be replaced. The coordination between these arriving formations and the units already fighting around Caen presented its own challenges. German command structures, for all their reputation for efficiency, were not immune to confusion and miscommunication, particularly when units from different branches of the military and different organizational hierarchies had to work in concert. The SS divisions answered to their own high command structures, which did not always align perfectly with army group directives or corps-level intentions. Yet necessity tends to force cooperation, and in the pressed circumstances of Normandy, these differences became manageable through sheer urgency and shared exposure to danger. The psychological impact of these reinforcements on the Allied side cannot be overlooked either. Intelligence reports of additional SS units moving into the sector spread quickly among British and Canadian forces, and the reputation of the SS, earned through brutal campaigns elsewhere, cast a shadow of apprehension over the ranks. The SS soldier had become, in the minds of many Allied troops, something different from the regular Wehrmacht, more committed, more dangerous, more willing to fight to the last man. Whether this perception was entirely accurate mattered less than the fact that it influenced decision-making and morale, creating a subtle but pervasive sense that the opposition was hardening rather than weakening. The logistics supporting these arriving units required a kind of orchestration that was becoming increasingly difficult as the battle progressed. Fuel, in particular, was proving scarce, not because the Germans lacked production capacity, but because the bombing campaign had so damaged the transportation networks that moving fuel from refineries to forward areas was becoming nearly impossible. Tanks and half-tracks that arrived at Caen were often running on near-empty fuel tanks, their drivers knowing that refueling would be uncertain and possibly hazardous. Ammunition, similarly, had to be carefully rationed even as consumption rates climbed, creating a constant tension between available supplies and operational demands. The presence of these reinforcements also meant that the SS units already engaged in the fighting around Caen could, in some cases, be rotated to the rear for regrouping, resupply, and the absorption of replacements. Yet this relief was rarely as complete as soldiers might have wished, for the rotation of units in or out of combat around Caen was never entirely clean or safe. The Bocage, with its countless hedgerows and its narrow passages, meant that movement of any kind exposed troops to fire and artillery, and the exchange of positions between units was often as dangerous as remaining in place. One might reflect on what such experiences do to men: the constant vigilance, the knowledge that even movement backward carried risk, the awareness that safety was never truly achievable. As these new formations settled into their positions around the city, a pattern began to emerge that would characterize the entire Caen campaign. The defense would be conducted not as a single orchestrated action, but as a series of local struggles, each company and platoon fighting according to the circumstances of its position and the pressures immediately around it. The overall German strategy was to hold Caen itself, while inflicting such casualties on the Allies that they would eventually accept a stalemate or negotiate peace. It was a strategy born of desperation, for Germany possessed no realistic hope of ejecting the invaders from Normandy once they had established lodgment, yet it was also a strategy that, for a time, seemed to offer at least the possibility of prolonging the war and complicating Allied plans. The reinforcements arriving around Caen in these early weeks of June, then, represented not a counter-offensive or a dramatic reversal, but rather an intensification of resistance, a thickening of the defence that would grind the campaign into attrition. The Panzer Lehr would arrive fractured and worn by air attack, but still formidable, its tanks and crews representing a leap in capability that would concern Allied planners. The SS units, arriving in smaller increments but with the fanaticism and professionalism that defined them, would prove to be among the most difficult opponents the British and Canadian forces would face. Together, they would transform Caen from a city expected to fall in hours into an objective that would require 7 weeks of relentless, grinding combat and cost both sides dearly in blood and material. The city itself, ancient and beautiful, would pay the price for its strategic importance, becoming in the process a monument not to triumph, but to the terrible cost of modern warfare. And so the morning light found the small market town of Villers-Bocage on the 11th of June, a place whose name would become etched into the memory of armoured warfare with a peculiar and terrible clarity. The town itself was nothing grand, you understand, a modest collection of stone buildings arranged along a main street that curved gently through farmland, orchards pressing in on either side, the kind of place where people had lived quietly for centuries, growing apples, raising cattle, knowing their neighbours by face and habit. But on this particular morning, it would become a crucible where the assumptions of an entire army would be tested and, for one brief and extraordinary moment, shattered. The British 7th Armoured Division, that storied unit that had pursued Rommel across the desert, had conceived a plan of elegant simplicity. They would drive north through the Bocage in a long armoured column, hoping to swing around the German left flank and push deep into the countryside beyond. It was the sort of manoeuvre that had worked before in more open terrain, and the theory was sound enough: break through, exploit the gap, create confusion and depth. By June 11th, the Allies had been ashore for 5 days now, and impatience was beginning to mix with confidence. Villers-Bocage lay beyond the dense hedgerows, on slightly higher ground, a place from which one could see across country with clearer vision. If the column could reach it, if they could establish themselves there, the entire German position might begin to unravel. A column of nearly 200 vehicles began that push before dawn, and the lead elements of the Cromwell tanks and the 1st Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, advanced along the narrow lanes with a kind of cautious momentum. The bocage here was particularly dense, the sort of landscape that funneled vehicles into predictable routes, eliminating choice, compelling direction. Imagine for a moment standing in a maze of stone walls and ancient hedgerow, each passage barely wide enough for a tank to squeeze through. Visibility restricted to perhaps 30 yards in any direction, the air heavy with dust and diesel exhaust, the radio crackling with intermittent reports. This was the environment in which the Cromwell tanks found themselves advancing, their crews alert but perhaps not alert enough, for the confident momentum of the column had a way of smoothing caution into routine. What happened next would later be described in accounts both German and British as something close to a masterpiece of ambush, though whether it was masterpiece or catastrophe often depends quite simply on which side of the guns one happened to be standing. A young German officer named Michael Wittmann, commanding a Tiger I tank of the 2nd Company, Heavy Tank Company of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, had positioned himself and his crew on the outskirts of the town. The Tiger was a formidable machine, the sort of tank that could penetrate the armor of a Cromwell from ranges at which the Cromwell could not penetrate the Tiger's thicker hide. Wittmann was 23 years old, already a veteran of service in the Soviet Union, where he had accumulated something close to 90 confirmed kills. He had that peculiar combination of youth and hardened experience that made him both fearless and tactically sophisticated. What followed, beginning around 7:30 in the morning, was a sequence of moments that unfolded with an almost dreamlike quality, events compressed and explosive, yet somehow measured in their terrible precision. As the British column rounded a bend near the town, Wittmann's Tiger opened fire, and a Cromwell at the head of the column was struck. The impact was catastrophic. The shell penetrated, the tank caught fire, men began to pour out of the hatches, some burning, some crawling. In the space of moments, confusion bloomed like a terrible flower. Vehicles behind the stricken tanks began to brake, to swerve, to seek cover in a landscape that offered almost none. Other British tanks returned fire, but at this range, their shots were largely ineffective against the Tiger's sloped armor. Wittmann and his gunner worked with extraordinary efficiency, picking off targets methodically, almost casually. What is particularly striking about this sequence, when one reads the accounts carefully, is the degree to which the German officer operated in a kind of clarity, while the British column dissolved into chaos. Wittmann's Tiger moved slightly, found new angles, and continued to destroy vehicles with a grim consistency. A Cromwell here, a jeep there, trucks bursting into flame. The British tried to organize some sort of response, tried to bring their superior numbers to bear, but the Bocage had a way of negating numbers, of reducing warfare to the possession of 1 or 2 pieces of high ground and the nerve to hold them. In perhaps the space of 10 minutes, Wittmann had destroyed something between 20 and 30 vehicles. Accounts vary, and the thickness of smoke and the confusion of the moment make precision difficult. But this was not the only German position, nor was Villers-Bocage itself undefended. As the initial shock of Wittmann's ambush rippled backward through the column, other German forces began to react. Panzer grenadiers emerged from positions around the town, anti-tank guns opened fire from buildings, and the entire nature of the engagement began to deepen. The British commander, attempting to salvage the situation, tried to organize a flanking movement, but the bocage, that landscape that had seemed to promise mobility and advantage, now transformed into a prison. The narrow lanes could not accommodate the deployment of sufficient force. The high hedgerows deprived him of vision, and German reinforcements were arriving with surprising speed. The burning tanks began to accumulate now. The smell of cooking ammunition, of burning rubber and fabric, of scorched metal and human agony mingled in the thick morning air. The sounds were equally terrible and particular: the sharp crack of anti-tank guns, the heavy machine gun fire, the occasional roar of an engine trying to start, or the screech of metal on metal as a turret traversed. Villers-Bocage itself had become a small but intense furnace of violence, and the question that would hang over this engagement, even to the present day, centers on a peculiar moment of pause. For Wittmann, after his initial extraordinary success, did something that remains somewhat mysterious. With the British column in disarray, with German reinforcements on the way, with an opportunity that might have promised a breakthrough of genuine significance, he seems to have withdrawn slightly, to have slowed his aggressive momentum. Perhaps his Tiger had been struck and damaged. Accounts suggest it may have sustained hits that affected its mobility, though this remains uncertain. Perhaps the arrival of British anti-tank guns had begun to create a counter-threat, or perhaps there was simply a moment where the weight of the engagement, the number of targets, the complexity of the situation, suggested a tactical retreat to more defensible positions. Whatever the cause, Wittmann's Tiger extracted itself from the immediate area, and the most intense phase of the ambush began to wane. What remained was a landscape of destruction. The British column, which had entered Villers-Bocage with momentum and apparent advantage, now found itself halted, its leading elements decimated or dispersed, the survivors clustered in defensive positions amid smoke and ruin. The Germans held the town and the surrounding country, and for several hours that morning, the question of whether a breakthrough had been possible seemed, at least to those involved, to have been answered with a terrible and definitive no. Subsequent British attempts to renew the attack encountered increasingly stubborn resistance as more German reinforcements poured into the area. By afternoon, it had become clear that Villers-Bocage would not be taken quickly, that the flanking maneuver had failed, and that the Germans remained capable of concentrating sufficient force to hold even an apparently weak position against determined assault. The loss of life and vehicles at Villers-Bocage would later be tallied and debated. The British claimed to have destroyed or damaged numerous German tanks and vehicles in return for their own losses, and this was true enough. Warfare at this level almost always involves such trades. But the psychological impact was immediate and significant. A division that had come to expect breakthrough and exploitation found itself checked, forced to consolidate, to regroup, to settle in for a longer and more grinding form of combat. Villers-Bocage became a kind of symbol, a place where the possibility of rapid victory seemed to evaporate, where the hedgerows and the stubborn German defense combined to suggest that Normandy would not be the short campaign some had hoped for. In the days and weeks that followed, Villers-Bocage would change hands several times, would be bombed and shelled, would become one of those places where the fabric of civilian life was simply torn away. But the engagement of June 11th remained the most vivid and immediate memory. The moment when an ancient town and a generation of young men collided in the space of a few hours, when the sound of burning tanks seemed to settle into the stone itself, and when the summer morning light fell on a landscape that had been permanently altered by sudden, concentrated violence. By the middle of June, the great momentum of the initial invasion had begun to slow, as if the entire Normandy front had drawn a long, weary breath and settled into something far more grinding, far more patient. The Germans, contrary to Allied expectations, had not crumbled. Instead, they had organized themselves in the Bocage, that ancient patchwork of dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, and stone-walled Norman fields. And there they had decided to make their stand, not through grand maneuver, but through the slow, relentless consumption of men and material that war becomes when neither side can break the other's will to endure. What had begun as a race to Caen, a city meant to fall in days, had transformed into something neither commander had foreseen with such clarity, a war of inches and hours, where victory was measured not in miles taken, but in the number of hedgerows seized, in the grinding exhaustion of constant small unit combat. The Waffen-SS, those young fanatics who had hoped to drive the Allies back into the sea through concentrated, violent counterattack, now found themselves engaged in a different kind of war altogether. They were being worn down day by day by an enemy that did not retreat when attacked, that replaced its losses with uncanny regularity, that seemed to have access to an endless supply of men, ammunition, and resolve. The Bocage itself became the dominant feature of this stalemate. It was terrain that had no grand vistas, no opportunities for the sweeping armor maneuvers that modern warfare seemed to demand. Instead, it was a landscape of claustrophobia, of limited sight lines, of small stone walls and massive earthen hedges that had been built up over centuries by Norman farmers, each hedge often 10 or 12 feet high, the earth beneath it root-laden and dense as concrete. To move through the Bocage was to move through a maze, and to defend it was to have 1,000 small fortified positions, each one potentially deadly. A single machine gunner could hold up an entire platoon. A single anti-tank gun, concealed in a sunken lane, could destroy tanks one after another as they came forward, offering themselves as targets to patience and camouflage. Can you imagine the experience of a soldier advancing through such terrain? The sense of being always watched, of having no clear path, of hearing gunfire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The hedgerows became a landscape of psychological torment as much as physical danger. They obscured the horizon. They made coordination nearly impossible. They turned warfare into something almost medieval, small clots of men fighting men at point-blank range in confused melees where no one could see more than a few yards in any direction. The summer heat intensified this misery. June turned into July, and the Norman summer, which is usually mild, pleasant, almost benign, became a furnace of dust and flies and rot. The fields grew choked with the detritus of modern warfare, empty ammunition cases, shattered equipment, abandoned vehicles half hidden in overgrown hedgerows. And there were bodies too, many of them. They lay in ditches and fields, often undiscovered or unburied for days, especially in the zones where the fighting was most intense and neither side could advance far enough to retrieve their dead. The smell, those who were there have testified, became part of the landscape itself, something that seeped into the uniforms, into the hair, into the very consciousness of men who had nowhere to escape it. The Germans, despite their professional training and their ideological fervor, found themselves trapped in this attritional grind. They had been taught to fight wars of movement, wars of concentrated firepower and aggressive counter-maneuver. Instead, they were defending linear positions that could not be held if the Allies chose simply to keep attacking, bleeding them slowly through waves of assault that the German command could not match with replacements. The Wehrmacht and SS divisions in Normandy were not being relieved. They could not withdraw. They were slowly being destroyed in place, their losses mounting, while the Allies, with their access to American industrial production and their steady stream of fresh troops, seemed almost indifferent to their own casualties, knowing that they could afford them in ways the Germans could not. The young men of the Waffen-SS, many of them barely 20 years old, many of them National Socialist Hitler Youth members, who had been convinced of the righteousness of their cause, began to understand in these weeks what the older veterans already knew, that ideological conviction is almost useless against the grinding reality of artillery fire and air superiority and numerical disadvantage. They were exhausted, most of them, by the end of June. They were digging deeper into their hedgerows, becoming more desperate in their defense, because they understood that they could not hold. They could only delay. What emerged from this stalemate was a curious and terrible calculus of attrition. Both sides were losing men at rates that would have seemed catastrophic in earlier conflicts, but the nature of those losses was very different. Allied casualties were being replaced. American divisions that suffered 10,000 casualties would eventually receive replacement drafts that brought them back to near full strength. German divisions had no such luxury. They received a trickle of replacements. Older men wounded in previous campaigns and now returned to duty, men transferred from other fronts, but never enough to truly restore them. By the middle of summer, even the elite Waffen-SS divisions had been reduced to perhaps 60% of their authorized strength. The British and Canadian forces, meanwhile, were learning the hard way that infantry alone could not break through the Bocage. They needed tanks, but tanks were nearly useless in terrain where they could not see their enemies and where they were vulnerable to anti-tank fire from all directions. What emerged was a slow dance of cooperation, where infantry would move forward under armor support, seizing a hedgerow, then holding it while supporting fire from artillery and tanks, tried to suppress enemy positions long enough for the infantry to advance again. The process might advance the line by half a mile in an entire day of brutal fighting. Then night would fall, and both sides would reorganize, treat their wounded, bring up ammunition, prepare to do it again the next morning. The Bocage stalemate was perhaps the most psychologically grinding phase of the Normandy campaign. There was no sense of progress, no grand objectives achieved, no strategic victories to point to. There was only the slow accumulation of small unit victories, small hedgerows taken, small numbers of enemy soldiers killed or captured. But from the perspective of the soldiers enduring it, day after day, it was everything. It was the universe. They lived in a landscape of perhaps 500 yards in any direction, and within that small universe, they fought with an intensity that consumed all their attention, all their courage, all their fear. The SS units, in particular, seemed to carry a certain desperation during this period. They had been told that they were the elite, that they would smash through the invasion forces and send the Allies fleeing back across the Channel. Instead, they were being slowly ground down in a Bocage hedgerow, dying not in glorious counterattacks, but in small, unmemorable skirmishes that would be forgotten almost as soon as they occurred. There is something in war records and unit histories, a certain bitterness in how these weeks are described, that suggests that even the most ideologically committed soldiers began to understand that something had gone very wrong with the plan. The summer advanced slowly, and the Bocage remained contested, bloodied, unchanged in any strategic sense, yet transformed utterly in its humanity. By late July, when the next major operations would begin, the men in those hedgerows, both German and Allied, had already paid a price in exhaustion and trauma that few of them would fully recover from. They had experienced something that modern war rarely offers: the grinding, patient, relentless pressure of trench-like warfare in an open field where there was no rotation, no relief, no end in sight except victory or annihilation. And in that grinding pressure, many of the certainties and fervor that had animated the early weeks of June had begun to wear thin, like cloth worn away by constant friction against the hard edges of reality. By late June, as the calendar turned towards summer's full grip, something shifted in the pattern of battle around Caen. The British and Canadian forces, bloodied but persistent, began to organize what they hoped would be the decisive stroke. It was called Operation Epsom, and for 7 days beginning on June 26th, the fields and villages southwest of Caen would become a crucible of armor and will, a place where Scottish regiments would push forward, through landscapes that seemed designed by nature to resist them, and where the Waffen-SS would make their stand with a ferocity born from shrinking options and absolute commitment to the soil beneath their wheels. The goal was almost elegant in its simplicity, though the execution would prove anything but simple. The British Second Army under General Montgomery sought to wheel westward from their existing positions, push through the Bocage toward the Odon River Valley, and establish what became known as the Scottish Corridor, a salient that, if held, would threaten to cut off and encircle the German forces still defending Caen itself. It was a maneuver that required coordination of thousands of men across broken ground, the movement of artillery in quantities meant to overwhelm, and the passage of tanks through narrow lanes bordered by thick hedgerows where every corner might conceal an anti-tank gun waiting in shadow. The very landscape that had slowed the Allies for weeks now became the stage where they would attempt to prove that numbers and organization could finally break through. The Germans, of course, could read maps as well as any Englishman. They understood immediately what Epsom represented, and they moved to counter it with the same urgency that the British brought to its execution. What followed was not a single moment of collision, but rather a grinding series of encounters across terrain that seemed to multiply itself endlessly, hedge after hedge, village after village, each one a small battle that would accumulate into something far larger. The 1st Highland Division, the 15th Scottish Division, the 43rd Wessex Division. These formations pushed forward with the kind of grim determination that comes only when men have already proven themselves and learned through hard experience how to persist. And moving to meet them, like iron filings drawn to a magnet's field, came the SS Panzer forces. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, under the command of Villers-Bocage, received orders to hold the line, to prevent breakthrough, and if possible, to crush the Scottish advance before it could achieve depth or consolidation. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, already bloodied and worn from weeks of combat, prepared to receive the assault. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, fresher than some but burdened with the same desperate circumstances that governed all German operations by this point, moved into position. What developed was not a clean Wehrmacht defense of the kind seen in some earlier campaigns, but rather something more visceral, the determined stand of men who knew that to yield meant eventually to lose everything, and who had been trained and indoctrinated to believe that surrender was itself a form of death. The Odon River, that modest waterway that would give the operation much of its character, curves through the landscape like a modest serpent. It is not a grand obstacle, not the Rhine or the Danube, but in the context of tank warfare through Bocage, it represented enough of a barrier to matter. To cross it required bridging operations, which required time, which the British hoped to buy by pushing hard and fast. The Germans understood that to hold the line of the river was to hold the key to the whole defensive position. Think of it as a line drawn on a map, but a line that had to be held by men in tanks and men in slit trenches, men who had to make decisions in moments and live or die by those decisions. The fighting that unfolded across those 7 days took on a particular character because of the terrain and because of the men involved. The SS Panzer Grenadiers. These were not conscripts in the traditional sense, not raw levies from the Eastern Territories, but rather volunteers and long-term members of the SS formations, men steeped in the ideology and training of the organization. They fought with a coordination and ferocity that the British commanders noted with respect even as they pushed against it. The Scottish regiments, for their part, advanced with the stubborn persistence of soldiers who had been assured by their commanders that breakthrough was possible, that this time the weight of numbers and firepower would prove decisive. And perhaps it would have been had the Bocage been any less dense, had the German resistance been any less skilled, had the weather been somewhat different, or had 100 other small variables tilted even slightly in the other direction. What actually happened was something more ambiguous. The British advanced, yes. They pushed forward across days of fighting through hamlets whose names would be remembered in unit histories: Chaux, Gavras, Tourmauville, Granville. They suffered casualties that mounted into the hundreds and then the thousands. They brought forward artillery in massed formations and sent shells across the landscape in quantities that seemed almost impossible. They moved armour forward in the face of anti-tank guns and panzers that appeared from hedgerows and copses with sudden, terrible presence. But the Germans did not break. The line along the Odon held. The breakthrough that was meant to encircle and destroy did not materialize. Instead, the British found themselves holding a salient that protruded into German lines like an arrow shot into flesh, a wound that bled but did not prove fatal, that consumed resources and lives without producing the decisive advantage that had been hoped for. And perhaps that is the nature of operations like Epsom. They are successes and failures at once, measured in ground gained and held, but also in time purchased or squandered, in casualties that mount on both sides, in the wearing away of will and organization that comes from sustained combat. The British had moved the lines forward. They had secured a foothold across the Odon. They had proven that German resistance, however determined and ferocious, could be pushed backward. But they had not achieved the encirclement, the breakthrough, the decisive rupture in the German line that would have precipitated collapse. The SS Panzer forces, commanded by officers who understood that their task was not necessarily to achieve victory, but simply to persist, to deny breakthrough, to trade space for time in the calculation that time itself was a commodity the Germans, with their shrinking resources and growing encirclement, could not afford to spend at the rate their enemy was willing to expend it. What emerged from Epsom was a kind of crystallized understanding on both sides. The Allies understood that the Bocage, combined with German skill and determination, made rapid breakthrough nearly impossible, and that their strategy would have to be less a matter of finding a weak point to exploit than of grinding attrition, of pushing forward in multiple places until the entire German position became untenable through exhaustion rather than dramatic collapse. The Germans, for their part, understood that they could not hold Caen indefinitely, that the resources required to maintain their position were draining away, and that unless they could somehow produce a sudden reversal in the military situation, through reinforcement, or through some new weapon, or some stroke of strategic luck, they would eventually be forced to give way. And so both sides prepared for what came next, understanding that the campaign would not be decided by a single brilliant maneuver, but by the accumulation of small advantages pressed day after day in landscape that seemed determined to make every yard of advance costly and contested. The quiet fields of Normandy, in the aftermath of Epsom, bore the marks of this contest. Tank tracks scarred the grass. Tree lines bore the pockmarks of shell bursts. Hedgerows were broken and burned in places where armour had pushed through, and in the villages and farmhouses, in the hospitals and aid stations, in the graves that were being dug, even as the fighting continued, the cost of the operation was being measured and recorded, minute by minute, in ways that no map or military summary could fully capture. The Scottish corridor had been established, held, and would remain a feature of the battlefield until Caen itself fell, which meant that Epsom, measured in the long view, had achieved something. But that achievement had come at a price that would be paid again and again as the weeks ground on toward the ultimate collapse. By the middle of July, after weeks of grinding close-quarters warfare in the Bocage, the British and Canadian commanders faced a problem that had become undeniable. The city of Caen, which was meant to fall within the first hours of the invasion, remained in German hands. The SS divisions and panzer formations had held their ground with a discipline and ferocity that had surprised even those who planned for German resistance. The initial estimates had been wrong, the timeline had fractured, and so the decision was made to bring down upon Caen something that would dwarf all the artillery and tank fire that had come before. On the evening of July 6th, as the light began to soften and long shadows stretched across the Norman countryside, the RAF began to prepare. Hundreds of heavy bombers, four-engined machines that had learned their terrible trade over years of campaign, were loaded with ordnance. The plan was simple in its enormity. They would arrive in the gathering dusk, they would open their bomb bays above the medieval city, and when they left, Caen would no longer belong to anyone in the way it had before. It would be rubble, it would be ash, it would be changed forever. The human mind, when faced with numbers on this scale, often finds them difficult to hold. Consider then that over 500 bombers were assembled for what became known as Operation Charnwood. 500, each one a vessel of destruction, each one a message written in fire from the sky. The tonnage would be staggering, more than 2,000 tons of ordnance, much of it explosive, much of it incendiary. The intention was to crush German resistance by flattening the defensive positions that held the city, to shake the will of those who held it, to open a path forward for the ground forces that waited in the heat beyond the perimeter. The bombers came at dusk, as was the way of such things. The darkness was not yet complete when the first waves appeared overhead, though from the ground the day had already begun to turn grey. The sound they made was not a single roar, but a gathering of roars, layer upon layer of engine noise approaching from across the channel. Those in the city below, both German soldiers and French civilians sheltering in cellars and quarries, heard it first as a distant tremor in the air, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound grew, it deepened, it began to fill the sky. What happened next occurred in waves, much like the bombers themselves. The first explosions were distant, felt more than heard, felt as a tremor through stone and soil. Then they began to march closer, closer. The bombs fell in patterns that had been calculated on maps in distant briefing rooms, but when they struck, they fell into a chaos that no map could predict. They struck buildings that had stood for 400 years. They struck the cathedral, the beautiful Gothic cathedral that had watched over Caen since medieval times. They struck civilian shelters. They struck German defensive positions. They struck the earth itself, leaving craters that could swallow trucks. The sky above the city became something other than sky. It became a thing of flames and smoke and light that was brighter than daylight, brighter than any sun. The heat rose from below in waves. The fires began to spread from building to building, leaping across streets, consuming timber and brick, and the dry heat of a summer evening. Those in the cellars and quarries below the city, in those deep places where the people of Caen had retreated, heard the explosions as a series of hammer blows, each one closer or farther than the last, each one a question about whether the shelter would hold, whether the earth above would collapse, whether they would emerge again into light. The bombing continued through the night, through the hours when vision itself became unreliable, when fire was the only source of light, and smoke was the only substance in the air. German defenders tried to respond, tried to fire anti-aircraft weapons into the darkness, but what could they do against this? What response existed to this magnitude? The bombers came in waves, and when one wave departed, another appeared. The tonnage continued to accumulate. The fires continued to spread. By dawn, when the bombing at last ceased, the city had transformed. The medieval heart of Caen was unrecognizable. Whole sections were gone, simply gone, replaced by rubble and ash, and the smell of burning that would linger for days. The cathedral, damaged though not destroyed, stood like a wounded thing above the wreckage. Streets that had existed for centuries had vanished. The Norman Romanesque churches, the half-timbered houses, the commercial heart of the city where merchants had bought and sold for generations, all of it had been rewritten in ash. It is worth noting, in the careful way that historians must note such things, that the bombing of Caen remains contested in memory and in moral reflection. The intention was military, certainly. The target was the German hold on the city. But intention and outcome are not always the same thing. The bombing destroyed German defensive positions, yes, but it also destroyed the city itself. It destroyed homes. It destroyed the infrastructure that would need to be rebuilt before the city could be truly liberated. It destroyed irreplaceable parts of history, and perhaps most immediately, most painfully, it destroyed and displaced the French civilians who had been sheltering there, the very people whom the invasion was meant to free. The defenders of the bombing strategy argued then, and some argue now, that it was necessary, that the cost in French civilian casualties and damage was the unavoidable price of liberation, that without it, the British and Canadian forces would have taken even longer to push the SS divisions back, and that a slower liberation would have meant more military casualties, and that such calculations, difficult as they were, had to be made. The critics, then and now, point to the rubble and ask whether there might not have been another way, whether the cost was truly necessary, whether the medieval beauty of Caen was worth the military advantage gained. Such questions do not have easy answers, and they were not meant to. History rarely offers easy answers. What is certain is that after that night of fire, Caen was transformed. The city had endured, but it had endured at a cost that would take decades to reckon. The bombs did not crush German resistance in the way that had been hoped. The SS divisions remained in place. The Wehrmacht remained. The fighting would continue for weeks more. But Caen itself had been broken, in a different way. The ancient stone had been touched by fire. The medieval city had been brought into the modern war in a way that could never be undone. In the days that followed, the bombing was examined, re-examined, and argued over. Had it worked? That depends on how one measures success. The defenders claim that it weakened German defences and demoralised troops. The critics claim that the very rubble the bombing created made a German defence even easier in some ways, turned the city into a labyrinth of collapsed buildings and narrow passages where armour and mobility, the traditional German advantages, counted for less. What is not disputed is the scale of destruction, the transformation of the landscape, or the fact that Caen would never quite be the same. For those in the city, whether in uniform or sheltering in cellars, the bombing was an event that divided time itself. Before, there had been war, certainly. There had been occupation and resistance and grinding attrition in the countryside. But after that night, after the sky had caught fire, the war had come home in a way that was unmistakable. The civilized world, such as it was, had been brought into proximity with total war. And as the weeks of fighting continued, as the battle for Caen stretched into August, that terrible night would remain in memory, a marker between what had been and what was yet to come. The ancient city, lit by its own burning, had been shown what the 20th century could do to the inheritance of centuries past. Beneath the collapsing city of Caen, in spaces never designed for the weight of history pressing down upon them, life persisted in a form almost unrecognizable to those who had known the streets above. The cellars of merchant houses, the stone quarries that had fed the city's construction for centuries, the crypts beneath the abbeys, these became the world for thousands of civilians who had nowhere else to go, no roads leading out, no promise of safety beyond the walls that were themselves turning to dust. It is difficult, perhaps, to imagine what such sheltering meant. The stone was cool, yes, and it offered a ceiling between the body and the rain of shells that had become as regular as weather itself. But stone is also a conductor of sound, and those who waited in darkness heard everything, the percussion of impacts, near and distant, the low rumble that travelled through earth as though the land itself was breathing in distress. Some accounts speak of children becoming so accustomed to these sounds that silence, when it came, was what truly frightened them. Silence meant something had changed. Silence meant the artillery might be moving, the front might be shifting, which meant neither safety nor knowledge of what would come next. The quarries of Caen, those vast chambers cut deep into the bedrock by generations of stoneworkers, became collective refuges. Hundreds of people gathered in spaces that were originally conceived as industrial voids, as hollows from which wealth was extracted. Now they held families, the elderly, the sick, infants born in darkness, whose first memories, if memory could form so young, would be of subterranean existence. The darkness was not absolute. People brought candles, oil lamps, whatever could be salvaged. The flickering light created a landscape of shadows and suggestion rather than clarity. And perhaps there was something merciful in that softness, in not being able to see clearly the full extent of what was happening to one's city, to see clearly the fear in the faces around you. One can imagine, and here we step into the realm of what the record allows us to infer, how the ordinary rhythms of life attempted to reassert themselves even in these conditions. Mothers would have tried to keep children occupied in the gloom. Some accounts mention schooling continuing, teachers working from memory to teach arithmetic and language in candlelit chambers. The human mind, it seems, seeks normalcy even when normalcy has been obliterated, and perhaps especially then. A lesson recited in a quarry is not the same lesson recited in a schoolroom, and yet the act of teaching, of attempting to pass knowledge forward, carries within it a kind of defiance that requires no weapons. Food was another matter entirely. The siege of Caen meant that supplies dwindled steadily. Those sheltering in the depths relied on what remained in the city, on rations that grew smaller with each passing week, on the compassion of those who still had access to resources, or sometimes on the deliberate mercy of German soldiers who, despite their orders and their ideology, were capable of recognizing suffering when they encountered it face to face. The documentary record and survivor testimony suggest that such moments of humanity, when they occurred, were remembered with an intensity that trauma often preserves. A German offering a portion of bread to a starving child becomes, in memory, a moment of profound significance, not because the bread would solve anything, but because in offering it, someone had acknowledged the child's existence as a human being worth saving. Sanitation in the quarries became an increasingly desperate problem as weeks turned to months. These were not facilities designed for habitation, and as summer heat pressed down and the confined spaces grew more crowded, disease became as much a threat as the shells that fell above. Dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses spread through the darkness and the damp. The very stone that had offered shelter became an environment where infection found purchase easily. Medical care, what little could be provided, relied on improvisation and the knowledge of whoever among the sheltering population possessed training or experience. Doctors and nurses, if they were present, worked by candlelight with minimal supplies, making decisions about who could be helped and who could not, bearing witness to deaths that occurred in shadow and silence. Above the quarries and cellars, above the subterranean world where thousands had retreated, Caen was being transformed into a landscape of ruin. The medieval cathedral that had stood for centuries was damaged, its stones becoming rubble. Homes that had housed families across generations collapsed into themselves. The streets became impassable, choked with debris, watched over by soldiers dug into positions, vehicles abandoned or burning. For those below, the knowledge of this destruction was both abstract and overwhelmingly concrete. They could hear it happening, could feel the vibrations in the stone, could detect, perhaps, the shift in the light that came through cracks and crevices when fire was overhead. They knew their city was dying, and they could do nothing but wait in darkness for its death to be completed. One aspect of life in the shelters that emerges from testimony is the strange compression of time that occurred. Days blended into one another in the absence of sunlight and the presence of constant, unresolved danger. Was it Monday? Was it summer or still spring? The normal markers by which consciousness measures its passage became irrelevant. Time became instead the space between the last impact and the next, between the last distribution of food and the next. Time became the length of darkness before someone opened a door, or climbed stairs, or brought news, though news, often contradictory and incomplete, may have been worse than no knowledge at all. The question of what it means to survive under such conditions, sheltered but imprisoned, alive but not living in any conventional sense, remains something that perhaps each person who endured it answered differently. Some accounts suggest that the shared experience of suffering created bonds of profound solidarity among those sheltering together, that families and strangers began to function as a single organism focused on mutual survival. Other testimony hints at tension, at the inevitable friction that arises when human beings are confined in darkness with insufficient food and no control over their circumstances. Likely both experiences coexisted, in different shelters, in different moments, as human nature expressed itself in its complexity. For children born into this darkness, for infants who took their first breaths in the cool air of a quarry or cellar, there was a strange mercy in that they would have no memory of it, or only the fragmentary, dreamlike impressions that the very young retain. They would grow up knowing they had been born during the siege of Caen, that their earliest existence had been subterranean, but they would not carry the conscious memory of what that meant. For the adults surrounding them, protecting them as best they could, that absence of trauma in the children was perhaps the only victory they could claim in those weeks of ruin. The stone preserved something, in its way. The stone held the shelter, held the people, held the waiting. The stone would endure long after the siege ended, would be repaired and rebuilt, would eventually frame homes and businesses, and lives restored to the surface and to sunlight. But for those who had sheltered within it during those 7 weeks, the memory of the stone, of the darkness, of the weight of the city dying above them, would remain part of their consciousness for the rest of their lives, a memory not of what was there, but of what was absent, of time suspended in stone, waiting for the world to become livable again. By mid-July, the British had grown impatient. The Americans were advancing steadily through Normandy's bocage and farmland, pushing inland with momentum that spoke of eventual breakout. Yet at Caen, 3 weeks had passed since the landings, and the ancient city remained firmly held. The cost of every advance had been mounting, not just in British and Canadian lives, but in the slow accumulation of exhaustion, supply strain, and the creeping awareness that the careful plans of invasion were already sliding into unforeseen complications. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British forces, believed he had identified a path through this stalemate. East of Caen, beyond the River Orne where the glider troops had first landed and held on against all odds, the ground opened into a broader plateau. It was here that the panzer reserves, still stretched thin, still recovering from the constant harassment of the first 3 weeks, might be overwhelmed by sheer weight of armour. If the British could punch through on this front, they might dislodge the entire German defensive line, force a collapse that would cascade westward, and crack open the gate to Normandy. Operation Goodwood, as it was named, was to be an enormous undertaking. On the morning of July 18th, in the blue-grey light before dawn, more than 2,000 guns opened fire across a frontage of some 40 kilometres. The earth itself seemed to rise and shake. The sound alone, that rolling, ceaseless thunder that had become the voice of modern war, began the assault. For hours the artillery and the RAF bombers would dance their terrible ballet, throwing tonnages of explosives at the narrow strip of ground where the SS and Wehrmacht defenders waited. When the bombardment finally lifted, the silence that followed was, perhaps mercifully, brief. The tanks came, Wave after wave of them, a mechanical tide rolling eastward across fields that had been farmland only weeks before. Shermans and Cromwells and Churchills, thousands of them, moving in coordinated formations, their tracks churning the summer grass into mud and ruin. It was, in its way, a moment of absolute British confidence, the moment when the logic of invasion, superior numbers, superior air power, the momentum of amphibious success, seemed ready to translate into irresistible force. And yet the Germans who waited for this assault were not entirely unprepared. This is a point worth resting on for a moment. The Waffen-SS divisions, and the Wehrmacht units alongside them, had spent these 3 weeks doing more than simply holding ground and absorbing casualties. They had learned the rhythm of British tactical doctrine. They had studied the patterns of advance, the timing of artillery preparations, the formations that emerged once the bombardment lifted. They had, in essence, become hardened through adversity into something more dangerous, more resilient than the fatigued troops that manned the first defences. The key to any defence against Goodwood lay not in trying to hold ground against the initial assault, that would have been futile, but in deploying armour and anti-tank guns in depth, in using the slight elevation of the Bourguebus Ridge and the terrain feature of the Bocage to create interlocking fields of fire. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, which included the hardened veterans of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the Das Reich divisions, along with elements of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend still nursing their wounds from earlier battles, had arranged their defences with a kind of thoughtful malice. As the British armour rolled forward into the afternoon sun, they encountered something they had perhaps not entirely expected, a defence that bent but did not break, that gave ground but did so in measured fashion, drawing the attacking forces deeper into interlocking fields of anti-tank fire. The SS crews manning the Panzers and the Panzerfausts, the gun teams serving the 88mm anti-aircraft guns that had become the terror of tank commanders, fought with a discipline born of fanatic training and, it must be said, a kind of grim professionalism that transcended ideology. The tank battles that unfolded across those fields were, in their scale and intensity, some of the largest armoured engagements of the entire Normandy campaign. Shermans burning in long columns, their crews bailing out across open ground toward distant hedgerows. Cromwells, faster and lighter, darting forward with high hopes only to encounter an 88mm shell that split their armour like paper. The British tankers fought with courage and determination, but they were learning a lesson that would repeat throughout the day. German gunnery was still superior, German armour discipline was still intact, and the Waffen-SS, despite their losses, despite their exhaustion, could still deliver a devastating counterblow. One must pause here to consider what was happening at a deeper level. The British infantrymen who followed the tanks, who pressed forward through the smoke and confusion, were soldiers of skill and determination. Yet they were also, many of them, growing soldiers, men who had trained in Britain and come across the Channel with high expectations, but also with a kind of necessary inexperience. The SS troops they faced, particularly the men of the Das Reich and the Leibstandarte, were veterans of campaigns in Russia and North Africa. They had seen war, on a scale that dwarfed what was happening in Normandy, had survived encounters with the Red Army that made even the formidable British and Canadian forces seem, in some ways, a more manageable proposition. The ground east of Caen became, that day and in the days that followed, a kind of proving ground where numbers and equipment met against experience and will. The British had air superiority so absolute that German aircraft rarely appeared. They had artillery support that was steady and available. They had reserves that could be called forward. Yet the SS held, gave ground grudgingly, and inflicted casualties at a rate that the arithmetic of attrition suggested should have been impossible. By the evening of the first day, The exploitation that was supposed to follow Goodwood had not materialized. British commanders had hoped to surge through the German lines, to reach the open ground beyond Caen, and threaten the entire German position. Instead, they found themselves grinding forward at a pace measured in hundreds of yards, each advance bought with the lives of soldiers, each small gain requiring renewed assault. The thing that many accounts of Goodwood tend to underemphasize, perhaps out of necessity, or perhaps out of the particular way that the Second World War shaped British military memory, is how effectively the SS units managed their defense. They had fewer tanks, less mobility in reserves, less artillery support. Yet they possessed something else, a kind of cohesion born of shared hardship, a training system that emphasized individual initiative within a larger structure, and a willingness to accept casualties as the cost of holding ground. This is not to say anything ennobling about their larger cause or their larger crimes. It is simply to say that they were, as military units, formidable opponents. The week that followed, the first day of Goodwood, saw the British gradually expanding their lodgment east of the Orne, slowly pushing the German line backward. But the hoped-for breakthrough, the moment when German discipline would crack and the defenders would begin to collapse, never came. Instead, what emerged was a stalemate of a different character. The SS and Wehrmacht defenders still held Caen and the territories immediately surrounding it, but they were being pushed into an ever tighter perimeter. Their reserves were being consumed at a rate that made replacement impossible, and the arithmetic of invasion, more men coming ashore each day, fewer Germans able to reinforce the line, began to work their slow, inexorable mathematics. By late August, the Canadian Second Army had been grinding through the southern suburbs of Caen for weeks, their progress measured in yards of rubble and the steady accumulation of names on casualty lists. The city itself had become less a prize to capture and more a labyrinth of ruins that seemed to swallow men whole. General Guy Simons, commanding the Canadian forces, understood that the breakthrough they needed would not come from further direct assaults into the Stone and Ash. Instead, he conceived Operation Atlantic, a maneuver designed to sweep around the southern flank of Caen's defences, to pour Canadian and Polish armour through the gap between the city and the Falaise Hills, and to cut off the German escape routes that still wound northward toward the Seine. The morning of August 8th was cool and grey, as so many mornings in Normandy that summer had been, and the Canadians moved out in columns that extended for miles, tanks and armoured vehicles and self-propelled guns, their engines creating a sound like distant thunder that rolled across the broken landscape. What distinguished Atlantic from the brutal frontal attacks that had come before was its ambition to move swiftly, to use speed and concentration of force rather than merely to absorb punishment mile after mile. The SS forces around Caen knew that their time was running out. The American forces were already far to the south and west, sweeping around them in a great encircling motion that would become the Falaise pocket. The German High Command had ordered a retreat, and yet the SS divisions still fought with ferocious determination, perhaps because they had nowhere left to go, perhaps because surrender meant trial and reckoning for men who understood what they had done. The Canadian advance split the air with artillery fire, waves of it, guns positioned far behind the front, laying down a carpet of shells ahead of the advancing columns. The Bocage, that ancient patchwork of hedges and sunken roads that had defended Normandy's interior for centuries, was being methodically destroyed, trees snapped like twigs, earth thrown into the air in fountains that hung for seconds before falling back to earth heavy with dust. The SS panzer units defending the southern suburbs were dug in well, but they were also growing thin. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend, those boys who had fought with such fanatical vigour in the early weeks, were now reduced to fragmented groups, their ammunition rationed, their losses irreplaceable. The 1st SS Panzer Corps commander, knew that his only hope was to delay the Canadians long enough for the bulk of German forces to slip away eastward, to buy time with the lives of men already marked for history's harshest judgment. As the Canadians pushed deeper into the suburbs, they encountered anti-tank guns positioned in the ruins of houses, Panzerfausts, in the hands of Hitler Youth soldiers who seemed to prefer death in the rubble to capture by the Allied forces advancing toward them. Each street presented a choice, each corner a potential ambush. The Canadian soldiers, many of them just as young as their SS opponents, had learned by now to move carefully, to respect the destructive power of desperate men fighting in familiar terrain. The tanks would fire first, their shells raking the facades of buildings where defenders were thought to be hiding, and then the infantry would move in, clearing what remained methodically, room by room, a grim and exhausting task that wore at the spirit even as it advanced the lines on the map. One must pause here to reflect on what Operation Atlantic truly meant, not simply as a military maneuver, but as a final closing of options for the German forces who had fought so hard to hold Caen. The Canadians moving through the southern suburbs were not merely capturing ground, they were cutting off escape routes, tightening the noose that would soon become the Falaise Pocket, the great trap in which a German army would be caught and destroyed. The SS units fighting in the rubble understood this. Some historians have suggested that the particularly vicious nature of the combat in these final days, the reduced willingness to take prisoners that manifested on both sides, stemmed partly from this understanding. When men know that capture means encirclement, that retreat means being caught in a closing ring, they fight differently. They fight as if they have already been condemned. The Canadian 3rd Division, attacking from the west, made perhaps the most dramatic progress through the suburbs, their tanks and armoured carriers moving in columns that sometimes travelled miles in a day, a rate of advance that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. Behind them came the Polish forces, the remnants of units that had lost homeland and family to the violence that Germany had unleashed on Eastern Europe. For Polish soldiers, the fight in these Norman ruins carried additional weight, a kind of reckoning with forces that represented everything Poland had suffered since 1939. The Poles fought with particular intensity, and though their units suffered grievously, they pushed forward with a determination that owed something to vengeance, something to honor, and something to the knowledge that this was their moment to strike back at an enemy that had devastated their nation. By August 11th, the Canadians had pushed through the southern suburbs and were approaching the towns and villages that lay beyond Caen, the gateway territory that opened toward the east and toward the possibility of encirclement. The SS units, still fighting in the city itself, were now in danger of being cut off entirely. German commanders were ordering withdrawal, and yet some units continued to hold their positions, either because the orders had not reached them or because the young officers and non-commissioned officers who led them believed that one more day of fighting might save lives elsewhere. It is a paradox worth considering. Does holding ground in a hopeless situation cost more lives than it saves? Does one man's sacrifice buy time for 10 others to escape? Or does it merely add one more name to the growing list of the dead? The breakdown of German command and control, hastened by the loss of so many experienced officers, meant that the withdrawal from Caen was neither orderly nor complete. Some units moved out in good order, tanks and vehicles moving in coordinated columns, their commanders maintaining discipline even in retreat. Other units fragmented, their soldiers scattered across the countryside seeking individual ways out of the encirclement, moving at night through the Villers-Bocage, trading military formation for the chance to slip through the closing ring as stragglers. The SS, bound by oath and ideology, fought harder to maintain cohesion than regular German army units, and yet even they could not maintain perfect discipline when the situation had become so obviously lost. The advance of Operation Atlantic accelerated as the days passed, and by August 12th and 13th, the Canadians and Poles had moved far enough east that the pocket was nearly closed. The Germans and SS troops still fighting in Caen and its immediate surroundings were no longer simply defending a position, they were fighting for their lives, understanding that encirclement was now inevitable, that the only question remaining was how many of them would escape before the ring tightened irrevocably. The suburbs of Caen, having endured weeks of grinding combat, now witnessed the final act of the battle, the desperate movements of men trying to avoid the great trap that was closing around them, and the Canadian forces pushing relentlessly forward, neither knowing nor particularly caring that history would remember them for closing the jaws of Falaise. By late August, as summer heat hung over the Villers-Bocage and the ruins of Caen still smouldered behind the lines, the German command structure faced a reality that no amount of fanaticism or discipline could any longer deny. The defensive perimeter that had held for 7 weeks was beginning to fray at its edges, and along those edges, a terrible mathematics was taking shape. The Allies, though they had paid an enormous price for every field and village, had finally broken through the last organized defensive line south of the city. Canadian forces under General Guy Simons had pushed beyond Falaise after weeks of bitter fighting, and American forces swinging up from the west were racing northward with gathering speed, their supply lines extending, but their momentum nearly unstoppable now. What was happening, though not yet fully grasped in the minds of the exhausted soldiers still holding the line, was a vast turning movement, a slow wheeling of forces that would transform the battlefield from a series of hedgerow positions into something far more dangerous, a trap, a pocket, a place from which escape would soon become impossible. The Germans, you see, were not retreating in disorder, not yet. The Waffen-SS units that had held the Bocage were still fighting with remarkable cohesion, still conducting tactical withdrawals that preserved their formations and their killing power. But each withdrawal carried them further north and east, toward Falaise, and with each step backward, the distance between the advancing Americans and Canadians grew smaller, tighter, more fatal. The order to fall back had come down through channels that were themselves beginning to show signs of strain. Command posts that had relocated 3 times in as many weeks were relocating again. Radio frequencies that had been stable were becoming unreliable. Supply trucks that had once arrived with regularity were now sporadic, delayed by Allied air power that owned the skies above Normandy so completely that daylight movement became an act of calculated desperation. And yet the SS divisions, the Hitlerjugend, the Das Reich, the Hohenstaufen, and others, continued to fight as they withdrew, their training and their fierce pride refusing to permit the kind of panic that might have consumed a lesser force. What we must understand, in the quiet of this narrative, is that the Falaise pocket did not emerge from a single catastrophic collapse. It grew from the steady contraction of a position that had become geometrically impossible to maintain. Imagine, if you will, a shrinking perimeter, one where the defenders are still dangerous, still capable of inflicting terrible casualties on those who press them too hard, and yet with each day the perimeter shrinks further, the encirclement tightens, and the options available to the trapped forces diminish with a logic that becomes almost mathematical in its cold precision. The SS men fighting here in late August knew what was happening. They were not naive, yet they continued to fight, whether from duty, from fear of what would happen if they surrendered, or from a final conviction that some miracle of German arms might yet turn the tide. We can only speculate, and history whispers rather than shouts its answers here. The Bocage itself, which had been such an advantage to the defenders for so many weeks, now became a kind of maze that no one could navigate with full certainty. A unit might receive orders to hold a position that, by the time the orders arrived, was already threatened from a direction no one had anticipated. Supply routes that had been secure the previous day were cut by Canadian patrols the next morning. The very complexity of the terrain that had allowed the SS to hold superior numbers at bay now made it difficult for scattered units to link up or to form coherent new lines of defense. And all the while, from the air, came the constant pressure of the Allied air forces, bombing roads, strafing columns, disrupting any movement that occurred in daylight hours. Consider the perspective of a young SS officer, perhaps 25 or 30 years old, who had been leading men through the Bocage for 8 weeks. He had won tactical victories here, had held ground that should have been overrun, had preserved the lives of some of his soldiers through skillful withdrawal and counterattack. But now, in late August, he could see the maps, if his command post still had reliable maps, and he could see what every educated soldier could see, that the Germans were being enclosed, that the Allies were converging on Falaise from multiple directions, and that unless a breakout occurred very soon, or unless new German forces could somehow arrive to restore the situation, his unit would be trapped. The fatigue that had accumulated over 8 weeks of continuous combat now pressed down with a particular weight, because it was fatigue without the promise of rest. There would be no rest until they broke out, or surrendered, or were killed. The retreat itself, which began in earnest around August 20th, was conducted in what we might call the German style, which is to say with precision, with rear guards, with organized movement rather than a rout. But precision and organization require roads, require clear orders, require a command structure that can actually communicate. All 3 of these things were becoming scarce. The roads out of the Bocage were limited. This was terrain with few major highways, and those few were under increasing observation by Canadian and British forces. Orders had to travel through channels that were themselves becoming fragmented as higher formations lost contact with lower ones. And the command structure, stretched thin by weeks of continuous combat and by the need to cover an impossibly large front with inadequate forces, was now facing a crisis that no amount of discipline or fanaticism could entirely manage. Yet still they fought their way backward. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend, which had been reduced by now to perhaps 30 or 40% of its original strength, still moved as a unit. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, under General Sepp Dietrich, was still fighting, though its panzer regiments had been worn down to a fraction of their tank park. The Das Reich Division and the Hohenstaufen, both SS formations, were contracting their perimeter, but doing so methodically, buying time in some places so that other units could disengage and fall back to new positions. It is striking, and worth pausing over, that units that had committed such terrible acts, or that, in the case of some of these formations, were at least deeply implicated in the ideology that had permitted such acts, conducted themselves in their final weeks with a military professionalism that Allied commanders grudgingly acknowledged. They fought hard and they fought well, but they were being fought not by an exhausted opponent that would require another year of carnage to overcome them, but by a freshly supplied, numerically superior enemy that had finally achieved the breakthrough that had eluded them for 7 weeks. By August 23rd, the jaws of what would become the Falaise pocket had begun to close. American forces, racing northward from the south after their breakthrough in the Cotentin Peninsula, were approaching the towns of Alençon and Cise. Canadian forces, pushing eastward and then northward from their positions near Falaise, were extending their lines toward Chambois, and Polish forces, fighting with a ferocity born partly from the knowledge of what had been done to their homeland, were advancing toward Montormel. These forces were not yet in contact, not yet closing the pocket, but they were converging with a steady inevitability that made it clear, to anyone looking at a map with a trained eye, that the window for escape was closing rapidly, perhaps closing by the hour. The SS units that would become trapped in the Falaise pocket did not become trapped because they panicked or lost their discipline or failed to fight. They became trapped because they had been ordered to hold impossible positions for as long as possible, while the campaign played out at the operational level far above the heads of individual soldiers. They became trapped because they were caught between the order to retreat and the order to continue resistance, between the need to escape and the expectation that they would stand and die if necessary. And they became trapped because the Allies, for all the difficulties they had experienced in Normandy, had finally managed to orchestrate a massive operational movement that would cut off a significant portion of the German forces in France from any possibility of orderly withdrawal. What followed in the days ahead would be catastrophic. The Villers-Bocage would become one of the most destructive encirclements of World War II. A place where the fighting would reach a kind of crescendo, where the carefully maintained discipline of the SS units would begin to crack under the pressure of surrounded, desperate men facing annihilation. But that moment had not yet fully arrived. For now, in late August, the noose was tightening, the space for maneuver was shrinking, and the soldiers of the Waffen-SS, who had held the Bocage for so long, were beginning a retreat that would have no true ending, only a terrible conclusion, waiting at a place called Falaise. By late August, the arithmetic of attrition had begun to speak more loudly than any command. The Waffen-SS divisions that had fought so fiercely through 7 weeks of Norman summer were no longer the formations that had deployed in June. They were, instead, shadows of those units, depleted, regrouped hastily, and now caught between the closing jaws of a trap they could no longer escape. What had been meant as a contained beachhead, a problem to be pushed back into the sea within days, had become something far more grave, an encirclement that tightened daily, hourly, with a patience born of superior numbers and dwindling fuel. Consider for a moment the simple mathematics of exhaustion. A soldier fires his weapon perhaps 10,000 times in a heavy engagement. A tank moves through Bocage, stops, fires, moves again, and each movement consumes fuel that cannot be easily replaced. An officer, after weeks without sleep deeper than a handful of minutes, begins to make small errors in judgment that compound into larger failures. These were not questions of courage. The young men of the 12th SS, the veterans of Das Reich, the tired panzer crews of the 1st SS, they would fight with the same fury in August that they had shown in June. But bodies wear down, machines break, and when resupply lines begin to fail, when fuel trucks no longer arrive, when ammunition becomes rationed to a few rounds per gun, then even the fiercest conviction cannot hold the line. The collapse around Caen, then, was not sudden, but rather like a thing slowly losing its breath. By the 25th of August, what remained of the German forces defending the city found themselves in a genuinely unprecedented situation. Behind them to the west, American forces were closing from the direction of Brittany. From the north, British and Canadian units pressed down through the suburbs and rubble. To the east, French forces and more Americans were driving hard toward the Seine. The Villers-Bocage, that terrible narrowing of escape routes southeast of the city, was constricting hour by hour. What had been a corridor became a passage, then a bottleneck, then merely a desperate gamble for any soldier fortunate enough to be in a vehicle fast enough to slip through before it closed entirely. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend, that division of boys barely into their 20s, had by this point lost perhaps half its fighting strength, killed, wounded, captured, or simply missing in the chaos of retreat. Those who remained were a curious mixture, the few remaining originals, hardened now in a way that only continuous combat produces, newer replacements hastily assigned to fill gaps in the ranks, and a thin scattering of officers and NCOs trying to maintain some semblance of unit cohesion. They had learned, through bitter experience, that the enemy's artillery was not only more abundant but more accurate, that the Allies' ability to call in air support within minutes meant that any concentration of troops was temporary, that survival often meant moving at night and hiding by day. The fanaticism that had carried them through the Bocage was evolving into something more pragmatic, a kind of grim, quiet determination to escape rather than to hold ground. Consider what wreckage tells us about the final weeks. In and around Caen itself, the landscape had become a kind of automotive cemetery. Panther tanks, pride of German armour, sat burnt out in corners of shattered streets, their turrets blown off by concentrated fire or air attack. Waffen-SS trucks, their drivers and passengers long since scattered, rusted slowly in orchards and hedgerows. Half-tracks lay tipped on their sides, their tracks still somehow gleaming in the sun. These were not just machines, they were the material substance of retreat, each one representing a supply line broken, a unit isolated, a group of soldiers forced to continue on foot into an ever-tightening net. The human cost of this final collapse is a thing difficult to measure with precision. We know, with reasonable confidence, that the Waffen-SS divisions around Caen suffered somewhere between 20 and 25,000 casualties in the entire campaign, killed, wounded, and missing combined. But in those final 2 weeks, the rate of loss accelerated enormously. A division that might have sustained 500 casualties in a single day in mid-July might lose 2,000 in a single engagement by late August. And now many of those losses could not be replaced. There were no more reserves arriving from Germany. There were no more promises of relief. There was only the steady pressure of forces closing in, and the slow realization among the men in the trenches and foxholes that the war, for them in Normandy, was about to end, either in capture, evacuation, or death. The silence that accompanied this collapse is worth noticing. In the earlier weeks of the campaign, there had been the constant noise of battle, artillery, small arms fire, the roar of engines, the screams of men and machines. By late August, in many sectors, there was instead a kind of exhausted quiet. Not peace. Nothing about this time was peaceful, but rather the sound of troops moving quietly through darkness, of vehicles running with as little noise as possible, of men speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. It was the silence of people who had begun to understand that they were not going to win, and who were now focused on the narrower goal of survival. The Bocage, which had been such a terrible advantage to the defenders in June and July, had become something else by August. It was a maze from which there was no exit. The very hedgerows and stone walls that had slowed the Allied advance so dramatically had now become barriers to German retreat. To move north, south, east, or west meant choosing a route through roads that were narrow, predictable, and covered by enemy observation. To move off the roads meant moving through farmland, where armor could not travel, and where infantry was desperately vulnerable to air attack. It was a kind of trap that had been constructed, unintentionally, not by the Allies, but by the very geography that both sides had fought over so fiercely. What happened to discipline in those final days? It is worth asking the question, because the answer tells us something important about the nature of the Waffen-SS and about the constraints under which they operated. Remarkably, and perhaps unexpectedly to those who view the entire organization through a lens of fanaticism and brutality, order largely held. Yes, there were instances of units dissolving, of soldiers abandoning their equipment and fleeing individually. There were cases of officers being relieved of command by their superiors because they had lost control of their formations. But the general pattern that emerges from contemporary accounts and later testimony is one of retreat conducted under discipline, organized, company by company and regiment by regiment, toward the remaining escape routes. This suggests something perhaps uncomfortable to acknowledge, that these were military organizations, first and fundamentally, which maintained their military character even in defeat. The supplies that had once seemed abundant, the ammunition, the fuel, the food, dwindled to almost nothing. Tank crews began abandoning their vehicles, not because they had been disabled in combat, but because there was no fuel to move them. Infantry units learned to ration ammunition to perhaps 10 rounds per man per day, which meant that engagement had to be selective, careful, and economical. Food became whatever could be scavenged from abandoned supply depots or requisitioned from the local population. It was a grinding, slow descent into material penury that no ideology could overcome. And yet there was no general collapse, no wholesale dissolution of formations. Instead, there was a coherent, if desperate, effort to preserve what could be preserved and to extract forces from Normandy before the Villers-Bocage closed completely. Some units managed it, others, caught in the final encirclement, did not. But the attempt itself, the effort to maintain unit integrity and discipline, even as the strategic situation became hopeless, speaks to something in military organization that transcends the particular ideology of the Wehrmacht or the Waffen-SS. By August 25th, the question was no longer whether the Waffen-SS could defend Caen. That question had been answered weeks before. The question now was whether any significant portion of the German forces in Normandy could escape before the pocket closed, and if so, in what condition would they emerge? The answer, for the SS units that had fought so bitterly through the Bocage, was that some would escape, those fortunate enough to be in the northern or eastern portions of the shrinking perimeter, while others would be trapped, forced to surrender, or fall in the final desperate battles of the encirclement. The great formations that had marched into Normandy in confidence would emerge, if they emerged at all, as fragments, depleted and scarred in ways that would take years, if ever, to heal. By the end of August 1944, the noose around Caen had drawn so tight that what remained of the SS defenders could no longer hold the line. The city itself had become less a prize of war and more a symbol of the costs of devotion without mercy, of ideology turned to ash and rubble, of young men who would not yield even when yielding was the only choice left. And so, on August 9th, Canadian and Polish forces pushed into what was left of the southern quarters, and the final defenders withdrew toward the Seine, toward whatever fate awaited them in the Villers-Bocage and beyond. What they left behind was not a city but a wound. Caen, which had stood for 1,000 years, which had housed Norman dukes and English kings within its ancient stone, lay almost entirely in ruins. 2/3 of its buildings were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. The medieval heart, the castle, the great churches, all had been hammered into fragments by the relentless bombing campaigns that had rained fire upon it week after week. The streets, if they could still be called streets, ran with dust and the smell of cordite and decay. And within the cellars and quarries where so many civilians had sheltered for 7 weeks, there emerged now a population exhausted, traumatized, grieving, yet somehow still rooted to this place, still determined to call it home. The liberation itself was strange and muted. There were no spontaneous celebrations as there had been in other French towns, no joyous crowds lining the streets with flowers and tears. How could there be, when the streets themselves were impassable, when so many of those who might have danced and sung were gone, dead under the rubble, or displaced, scattered to makeshift camps and relatives' homes in the countryside? The arrival of the liberators was, for many, simply a relief that the bombardment might finally stop, that their children might emerge from underground without fear of the next wave of artillery fire, that they might stand in daylight without calculating whether the next shell would find them. And yet, even in this moment of exhaustion and grief, something began to stir in the hearts of Caen's people. There was a deep, almost instinctive impulse to rebuild, not to erase what had happened, that would be impossible and perhaps unwise, but to reclaim their city, to restore it, to show through the act of rebuilding that they endured, that they persisted, that Caen itself was not merely a casualty of war, but a place with a future beyond the ashes. The reconstruction began almost immediately, with the most pressing need, clearing the rubble. Across Europe, this work would consume years, but in Caen, it began while the sound of distant gunfire still echoed. Rubble removal teams, many of them German prisoners and forced laborers, worked systematically through the streets, hauling away the stones, bricks, and twisted metal that had once been shops, homes, schools, and lives. It was back-breaking work, and it was slow. Estimates suggested it would take decades to clear completely, and indeed, even today, more than 70 years later, new fragments still emerge when foundations are dug for new buildings. The rubble had not simply vanished, it had sunk into the earth, become part of the physical geography of the city itself. But Caen's leaders and its people possessed something beyond mere physical determination. They possessed, it seems, a very French impulse toward beauty and permanence even in the face of obliteration. Rather than rebuild Caen as it had been, they chose, gradually, to rebuild it thoughtfully. The medieval core was too damaged to restore completely, so instead, the planners of the reconstruction decided to create something new while honoring the old, to weave together the fragments of the medieval city with clean, modern architecture that spoke to the future rather than dwelling exclusively in the past. The castle was not fully restored, though its outer walls were stabilized. The great churches were rebuilt, but slowly, with care. New streets were laid out in patterns that allowed for traffic and light and modern urban life. Housing was constructed according to contemporary standards rather than nostalgic repetition. And throughout all of this, there was a conscious decision to preserve and display the evidence of what had occurred, to make the scars visible rather than hide them. Perhaps this was the deepest wisdom of Caen's rebuilding. Rather than attempting to erase the 7 weeks of siege and bombardment, the city chose to remember them. The ruins of certain buildings were left standing, walls blasted open to the sky, as monuments to what had been lost. Plaques and markers were placed throughout the city, documenting who had died, what had been destroyed. The old university, damaged but not wholly destroyed, was carefully restored and reopened, becoming again a center of learning and intellectual life. And gradually, decade by decade, Caen transformed from a place of pure loss into a place of loss and remembrance, of pain acknowledged and slowly of hope rebuilt. The psychological dimension of this reconstruction was perhaps as important as the physical one. For the people who had sheltered in the underground quarries for 7 weeks, the act of walking above ground again, of working to restore their homes, of seeing new buildings rise where destruction had reigned, was a kind of collective healing. It was not forgetting. Caen has never forgotten, but it was a way of saying that the city was more than what had happened to it, that human determination and connection could draw new meaning from devastation. The 1950s saw Caen transformed into something new, not quite the medieval city it had been, but something authentic nonetheless. The old medieval quarters, where they had survived, were preserved with care. The castle keep stood restored. The churches, rebuilt in their essence if not in every stone, again became centers of spiritual and community life. And around them, a modern city grew, with clean lines and contemporary architecture, with wide streets that would not have surprised a 20th century planner, yet with a consciousness that never allowed its past to be forgotten. Perhaps one of the most poignant aspects of Caen's reconstruction was the establishment of cultural and memorial institutions designed to ensure that what happened would not be lost to time. Museums were created, archives were assembled, oral histories were recorded long before such practices became standard. The city's leadership understood, perhaps, that physical reconstruction was only half the task. The other half was to preserve memory itself, to make sure that future generations would know not just that Caen had been destroyed and rebuilt, but why and at what cost. By the 1960s, Caen had become a symbol not of destruction but of resilience. Its streets bustled again with daily life. Markets returned, schools reopened, the university expanded. Young people grew up in a city that bore the marks of its history but lived firmly in the present. And yet, walking those streets, if one knew where to look, one could still see the scars, a building rebuilt in modern style adjacent to a medieval wall, a gap in a row of houses where nothing had yet been constructed, a plaque marking where a neighbour's family had died. What Caen ultimately embodied was a particular kind of European response to total war. Rather than burying its past or attempting to erase it, rather than reconstructing nostalgically as if nothing had changed, Caen chose to build forward while remembering backward, to acknowledge its pain while refusing to be defined solely by it. The 7 weeks of bombardment and siege had tried to obliterate the city. In response, the city chose not merely to exist again, but to exist consciously, with intention, with memory woven into every new stone. And in this way, Caen became a living monument to something deeper than military history or tactical importance. It became a testament to the capacity of people to endure, to rebuild, to find meaning not in the obliteration that had been inflicted upon them, but in the act of restoration itself. The rubble, slowly cleared and carried away, was transformed through effort and hope into the foundation of something new. The silence that had followed that August day in 1944, the terrible silence of a dead city, gradually filled again with voices, with commerce, with laughter, with the ordinary sounds of people living their lives. And perhaps that is the truest liberation of all, not the moment when soldiers arrived and the fighting ceased, but the long, patient, almost invisible moment when a city decided to be alive again, when its people chose to turn their faces from the ashes toward whatever future they might still build together. The fields beyond Caen, which had run red and black with the violence of war, slowly returned to their green. The sky, which had burned with fire, returned to its simple blue. And above it all, gradually, the spires of churches rose again, the streets filled with people again, and memory began its long work of transforming devastation into history, history into understanding, and understanding into the kind of peace that only comes when a wound is acknowledged and allowed, slowly, to heal. The hedgerows of Normandy are very quiet now. If you were to walk among them on a summer afternoon, when the light falls long and amber across the fields where the Bocage once channeled desperate men toward one another, you would hear only the ordinary sounds of countryside, the murmur of insects in the tall grass, the occasional call of a bird moving between the twisted apple trees, the soft percussion of wind through leaves that have no memory of what fell around them 70 years before. Yet memory persists in ways that are neither loud nor insistent. It lives in the names carved into small monuments that stand at crossroads, in the careful rows of white crosses arranged in cemeteries where the dead from 7 nations rest beneath the same patient sky. These places ask a question of the living, though not always with words. They ask simply, do we remember? And perhaps more gently still, what does it mean to remember? The ruins of Caen were rebuilt with deliberate care. The city rose again from the rubble, where it had been nearly erased, its medieval streets restored, its university reopened, families returned to homes they had lost, or rebuilt entirely new ones from the foundations upward. In doing so, Caen became something remarkable, a place where restoration was itself an act of remembrance. Each stone laid, each facade returned to its original form, was a way of saying that the city itself would not be forgotten, would not remain broken. But there is another kind of remembrance that happens more quietly. in the space between knowing and unknowing. The young people who walk through Caen now, who sit in its cafes or attend its schools, they carry the weight of that history in their very presence there, though they may not feel it pressing down upon them. The ground beneath their feet holds the names and stories of people who will never walk those streets again, and perhaps this is the truest form of what remains, not a burden exactly, but a presence that shapes the quietness itself. The cemeteries of Normandy are tended with extraordinary precision. The grass between the graves is cut with geometric care. Flowers are placed regularly, kept fresh. There are visitors throughout the year, some of them descendants seeking the names of those they never knew, others drawn simply by the enormity of what occurred there. Many stand for a long time before a single grave, reading the inscription as though the carved words might somehow bridge the distance between the living and the dead. In that stillness, something authentic happens, a moment of genuine connection across the decades that separates us from July of 1944. What does it mean to remember such things? This is perhaps a question without a clean answer. To remember the Waffen-SS is not to honor them, certainly. To hold their story in mind is not to absolve them of what they did and what they represented. Yet neither is it possible to truly understand the Second World War or the human capacity for sacrifice and cruelty without allowing ourselves to think through the lives of those soldiers, many of them conscripts, some of them volunteers, nearly all of them young men shaped by a regime that had taught them to believe in things that were deeply, fundamentally wrong. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division was composed largely of boys who had grown up under the Nazi state from childhood. They had been trained in the Hitler Youth, indoctrinated by propaganda that had seemed to them the most natural thing in the world. When they arrived in Normandy in June of 1944, they were not yet fully formed as people. Their brains, their moral sensibilities, were still capable of change, still unfinished. This does not excuse what some of them did, but it complicates the story. It suggests that the men who fought in those hedgerows were not demons, but human beings placed in inhuman circumstances and shaped by forces larger than themselves. To remember this complexity, to hold it gently in mind without either condemning nor excusing, is perhaps the most honest form of remembrance we can offer. The fields of Normandy have become spaces where this kind of thinking is possible. The warfare is long over. The tanks have rusted into earth. The sounds of gunfire and engine noise, and men's voices crying out in fear or rage, have faded into a silence that has lasted for decades now. What remains is the opportunity to think clearly about what happened, to learn from it, and to carry forward whatever wisdom we can extract from so much suffering. The light in Normandy at dusk is particularly beautiful in summer. The sun descends slowly toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the bocage. The fields seem to extend endlessly in all directions, and standing in the middle of them, you might feel the weight of time, not as something oppressive, but as something present, something that connects every moment that has passed in that place. The people who died there died in that light, or in darkness, or in rain, or in mud. Their deaths were concrete and specific and irreversible, yet they have become part of something larger now, part of our collective memory, part of the story we tell ourselves about how we came to be who we are. The forgetting, too, is inevitable. With each passing year, fewer people remain who experience those 7 weeks directly. The survivors grow older. The generation that lived through the war passes into history. And gradually, the events of 1944 become more distant, less immediate, less real, in the way that living memory is real. This is not a tragedy, precisely. It is simply the natural movement of time. But it suggests that the work of remembrance becomes more important with each passing year, that we must consciously hold these stories in our minds, must deliberately choose to learn from them, or risk losing something essential about ourselves. There is a particular kind of peace that comes over the Normandy countryside at night. The fields lose their definition in darkness. The monuments and memorials become invisible. The cemeteries are locked at sunset, their gates closed, their orderly rows of crosses and stars rendered unknowable in shadow. In this darkness, the past and present seem to merge. The screaming and the gunfire and the desperate struggles become inaudible. What remains is only silence, deep, patient, encompassing silence. Yet even in this silence, the story persists. It lives in the soil. It lives in the names carved in stone. It lives in the minds of those who have chosen to learn it, to hold it carefully, to pass it forward. The 7 weeks of Caen's ruin were not erased by its rebuilding. They were, instead, transformed into memory. And memory, when treated with care and honesty, becomes something that can teach us about ourselves, about our capacity for both courage and cruelty, about how quickly ordinary circumstances can become extraordinary, about how fragile the structures of civilization truly are. The fields are quiet now. The farmers work their land as their ancestors did, raising crops where soldiers once fell. The wheat grows gold in summer and is harvested in autumn. The apple trees blossom in spring. The seasons turn with their ancient regularity, indifferent to what occurred beneath their watch. And yet, somewhere in the turning of these seasons, the story remains, not as something that haunts or disturbs, but as something that informs, that teaches, that connects us to those who lived and died in those 7 weeks of heat and dust and desperate fighting. As you drift now towards sleep, you might hold this thought gently in your mind, that the work of remembrance is a gift we give to those who came before us, and also a gift we give to ourselves. In choosing to learn their stories, to sit with the complexity of their experiences, to honor both their sacrifices and their failures, we practice a kind of careful humanity. We acknowledge that the past is not truly past, that it lives in the ground beneath our feet, that it shapes the present moment in ways both visible and invisible, that it calls to us across the years with a voice that grows quieter but never entirely silent. The world around Caen continues. Birds still sing in the orchard trees. Families still gather in the rebuilt city. Life persists, as it always does, carrying forward. And perhaps this, too, is a form of remembrance, not a dwelling in the past, but a commitment to building something good and true in the present, in honor of all those who struggled in that place, on either side of the divide that war creates. Let the story settle now, like evening settling over